The Alpha Cult's Runaway Bride, written by Short Story Queen. Chapter 1. The Bride in White.
Selene's point of view. The robes itched, not against her skin, but somewhere deeper, somewhere bones couldn't reach and muscle couldn't soothe. They had been brushed with ash, anointed with the oil of moon-blessed tallow, stitched by hands that never spoke above whispers. Seline stood still as they wrapped the final cord around her waist. A silver strand meant to symbolize purity, or sacrifice, or surrender. No one had ever given her a straight answer. The temple was quiet, too quiet for a gathering of wolves. Not even the children were allowed to howl tonight. Candles burned in rows, their wax bleeding onto stone like melted skin. High above, the open ceiling revealed the moon, full, watching, judging. They said she was chosen, that the moon goddess had reached down and plucked her from the womb, marked her to become something holy. A bride, they called it, a gift to the prophet. But Seline had never felt like a gift. She had only ever felt given. Her wolf, silent for as long as she could remember, remained curled in some distant shadow of her mind. Leora had not spoken since she was 8, not even when she was whipped, not even when she bled, not even now. The other women in white lowered their heads as she passed, eyes down, hands pressed together. No one looked at her face. Not even her mother, who had once sung to her in secret and brushed flowers into her hair. She had been the first to turn away when the mark appeared. They led her to the altar. It was carved from black stone, older than memory, smoothed by the bodies of the brides who had lain on it before. She could still see faint streaks. Wine, they claimed. But Seline knew the scent of old blood, the kind that seeped into rock and never left. The prophet hadn't arrived yet. He would descend from the high chamber when the stars aligned and the last bell rang. She was to wait, kneel, pray, submit. But tonight, something fractured. It wasn't a thought, not a voice, not a scream, just a splintering. As if one bone in her hand turned the wrong way, and with it, everything else followed. Selene's fingers curled around the ceremonial dagger she was meant to hand over as part of the ritual. Her knees never touched the altar. Her body turned before her mind did. And then she ran. She heard no footsteps behind her, only the rising pitch of alarm. A howl. Then another, but she didn't stop. Through corridors where incense made her gag, past halls she wasn't allowed to look into. She didn't pause when her feet tore open on the stone path, or when the cold bit into her skin like the jaws of some invisible beast. Out. Just out. She passed the outer gate, past the threshold of the temple, into the woods that no acolyte ever returned from. She didn't look back.
Kale's point of view. The scent came first. Blood, but not from prey. Not fresh kill. This was something else, feminine, metallic, threaded with the sharp sweetness of fear. Kale crouched where the territory ridge overlooked the western woods. His patrols had reported nothing, but his wolf, Varric, stirred with unease. He rose silently, stepping down the slope in long, quiet strides. No howl, no call. He didn't need a witness to whatever mess this would be. Then through the trees something white flashed. For one moment, he thought it might be a deer, rare in winter, maybe even injured. But no. It was fabric, a figure. A woman, staggering, clutching her side. Her robes were soaked through with mud and blood and smoke. She crashed through the undergrowth, tangled hair trailing like a shroud, and fell just before the border stone. She collapsed, didn't move. Kale's feet carried him the rest of the way before he gave himself permission to decide. He stopped at the edge of her reach. No movement. No sound. Not unconscious, though. He could hear the breath. Shallow. Panicked. Catching. He crouched beside her, fingers brushing her neck first. Always check for a pulse. It fluttered, fast but steady. Her skin was cold. Then he saw the mark, burned just beneath the curve of her collarbone. A crescent. Not natural. Not earned. Branded. The Moonlight Covenant. A growl rose unbidden from his throat. Varric clawed forward in his mind, snarling. Send her back now, before it costs us everything. Kale ignored him. Lifted the girl carefully, testing her weight. She made no sound. No resistance. A body without fire. Yet her scent. It lingered strangely in his chest, like a question he didn't want to answer. He carried her across the boundary anyway. Selene's point of view. Her first awareness was not of safety, it was absence. No moon above her, no voices in her head, no prayer, no link. Silence. Then came the cold. It lived beneath her skin now. Not just on it. Her eyes blinked open slowly. A ceiling above her. Not stone, but wood. Old wood. There was warmth, but not from fire. From thick fur pelts and maybe the body heat of a room not built for ceremony. She sat up too fast, the world spun, chains clinked. Not chains. Soft restraints. Fabric bindings at her wrists. Looped loosely around the post of the bed. Not tight. Not cruel. Just firm. She didn't scream. Just closed her eyes. Took inventory. She wasn't naked. The white robes had been removed, replaced with a simple cotton tunic. Someone had cleaned the blood from her feet. She didn't know what was worse, that they had touched her or that they had done it gently. Then the door opened. He didn't move like a priest, he didn't carry power like the prophet. There was no sermon in his eyes, only steel. He was tall, broad, in a way that spoke of strength not shown, but used. His gaze pinned her, not with reverence or hunger, but calculation. He said nothing, just looked at her, long enough to make the silence hurt. You crossed into Shadowclaw territory, he said finally, his voice low and quiet, like something scraped from stone. Seline nodded once. She expected to be struck, and he didn't move. Why? Her throat burned. Words hadn't left her lips in days. Maybe weeks. She looked down at her hands, the fabric ties, the floor, anywhere but him. I ran, she whispered. Kale watched her carefully, not as a man who saw beauty, as a wolf who smelled danger. She waited for judgment, and instead he stepped back and locked the door behind him. But for the first time in her life, the sound of the lock did not feel like a cage. It felt like a pause, a moment between fate and something else. She didn't know what it was, but she knew. She wasn't going back. Chapter 2. Into the Forbidden Wood.
Selene's point of view. There were no stars in this part of the world, or if there were, they refused to shine through the thick canopy above her head. Light didn't reach her here. Not moonlight, not firelight, not the kind that slipped through stone temple slats during evening prayer. Only shadows moved here. Deep ones. Heavy. And yet, she didn't fear them the way she'd been taught. The forest pressed in around her, roots twisted like old bones beneath the brittle undergrowth. Her legs, raw and bare from running, stumbled again as she picked her way between branches that clawed at her like fingers. Her robes caught, tore, bled from the hem like wounded silk. She didn't stop. Couldn't. Behind her, the howl had gone quiet, but silence was worse. Silence meant tracking. They would come. They would never let her go. Not when she'd been named the moon's bride. Not when her blood had been promised. Selene's breath rasped, catching on the memory of the dagger she hadn't used and the altar she never touched. Every step away from that place felt wrong and right at once, like she was undoing something inside herself with every stride. Leora still hadn't spoken, but there was movement. Small, fluttering, like a pulse behind her ribs. Her wolf was waking. She didn't know this territory. She had only heard stories, half-whispers traded behind shut doors about the land beyond the trees. Shadowclaw, godless, savage. She had believed those stories once. She had believed many things. Her foot slipped. She caught herself too late. The world tilted. Pain tore up her ankle and flared in her ribs where she'd hit something hard. A sharp breath escaped, too loud, too desperate. Her hands dug into the frozen earth, fingers sinking into damp leaves and rotted pine needles. She tried to rise, but the tree spun. Everything spun. The cold no longer bit her skin. It seeped inside, heavy, numbing. Her knees gave out. Her palms flattened against the ground, and her eyes blurred with the shock of it, the weakness, the waste of it. She had made it out. She had crossed the border. But now, here she was, collapsed like an offering too ruined to accept. The last thing she saw before her eyes closed was a shadow moving through the trees, not large enough to be the prophet, but not small enough to be mercy. And then, everything went dark.
Kale's point of view, he should have turned her over. That was the first thought when he laid eyes on her. Pale and shivering in the center of his guest quarters, the scent of sacred oils still lingering around her like a stain that wouldn't lift. Covenant. He hated the word, hated the way it echoed in his memories, older than his own leadership, older than the scars along his shoulder. And yet, here she was. Kale hadn't spoken again since he locked the door behind him. He needed time, distance, perspective, but even as he left, he could feel the ghost of her presence in the air behind him, frail, uncertain, somehow still breathing through the fire in her blood. He paced the corridor, avoiding the gazes of the others. Elias would ask questions. Rhea would want answers. He didn't have any to give yet. All he had was a girl who looked like frost and bled like sacrifice, sitting quietly in the room of a man she'd been raised to fear. Her scent was still on him. It clung beneath his skin, unfamiliar and disquieting. Not mate scent. Not yet. But something layered, complicated, impossible to categorize. Kyle didn't like things he couldn't categorize. When he returned an hour later, she hadn't moved. She sat curled at the farthest edge of the bed, knees drawn to her chest, eyes open but unfocused. Not sleeping. Not resting. Just waiting. Like she expected someone else to enter. Someone worse. Her fingers clutched the fabric of the tunic Rhea had given her. She didn't seem to register his return until the lock clicked softly behind him. Still, she didn't speak. Kyle didn't move closer. He stood near the wall, watching her in the dim light. She reminded him of a creature caught in a trap, tensed for pain even after the jaws had released. Not out of fear, but habit. Something conditioned. He took a breath, slow and deliberate, folding his arms across his chest. "You're not a prisoner." She flinched, not a violent flinch, barely a twitch, but it was enough. "You're not my prisoner," he corrected, slower this time, softer, though he hated softness in his voice. She said nothing, but her eyes flicked toward him, a quiet flash of doubt threading through silver-gray irises that didn't seem to know how to trust light. He let the silence stretch between them, heavy as smoke. Kyle could feel Varric pacing in the back of his mind. The wolf didn't like this either. Not the girl, not the silence, not the weight she brought with her like a curse she hadn't asked to carry. He should have walked away, he didn't. Instead, he reached for the small flask tucked into his belt, uncapped it, and placed it on the wooden table near her. Water. She didn't reach for it, though he noticed the flicker of her throat when she swallowed. He didn't ask her questions. Not yet. She wouldn't answer them. She was still in that space between worlds, between obedience and choice, between temple and forest. She didn't know which one had claimed her. Kyle turned to leave, his hand brushing the doorframe. He hesitated. "I won't chain you," he said, without turning around. "But if you run, I won't follow." That wasn't a threat. It was a boundary. She didn't respond, but as he stepped into the hall, he heard her whisper something so low he almost missed it. "Good?" It wasn't defiance, it sounded like grief.
Selene's point of view. He didn't touch her. He hadn't since the woods, and even then, his hands had been firm but impersonal, like he was handling something fragile but unwanted. That should have eased her nerves. It didn't. The prophet had touched her often, his hands soft, his voice always wrapped in warmth that disguised the rot beneath it. Kindness could be cruel. It was harder to name cruelty when it smiled at you. But this alpha, Kyle, he didn't hide his coldness. He wore it openly, like armor. And something about that clarity both unsettled and grounded her. It meant she didn't have to guess, didn't have to watch for the moment the smile turned sharp. She waited hours after he left, counting the breaths between shadows, listening for footsteps that never came. No guards, no locks engaged again. Just a room with walls that didn't echo with prayer. When she finally reached for the water, her hands shook. Her throat burned when it slid down. She coughed quietly, then stopped herself. Too loud. She curled beneath the blankets, not to sleep, but to disappear. The scent of pine and smoke clung to the fabric. Male, earthy, unfamiliar, but not offensive. Not like the sweet, stifling perfumes used during cleansing ceremonies. This was real, grounded. It made her wolf stir again, a restless flick of awareness beneath her skin. Leora didn't speak, but she was closer now. The night passed slowly. She didn't dream of the temple. She dreamed of shadows moving through trees and a pair of eyes watching her. Not like the prophet had, but like they wanted to see who she was when no one else was looking. When morning came, she didn't pray. And for the first time, the silence felt like her own.
Chapter 3. The Alpha Who Found Her. Kale's point of view. Morning didn't soften the situation, it sharpened it. Daylight filtered through the high windows of the lodge, catching on dust and old beams, illuminating a problem Kyle had not resolved overnight. The girl was still there, still breathing, still carrying the scent of the Moonlight Covenant into the heart of his territory, like a spark dropped into dry pine. Kale stood outside the closed door longer than he cared to admit, listening. No frantic movement, no sobbing, no prayer murmured under her breath, just the quiet rhythm of someone awake and trying not to be noticed. That alone unsettled him. Most runaways filled silence with desperation. She treated it like a discipline. Varric stirred, restless but restrained. "She does not feel like bait," the wolf murmured, voice low and heavy inside Kale's skull. "But she will bring hunters." "I know," Kale thought back, jaw tightening. He pushed the door open. She was standing now near the narrow window, light touching her hair and turning it almost white. It fell loose down her back, no longer braided in the careful, ceremonial patterns of her former life. She'd pushed the blankets aside, and the borrowed tunic hung slightly too large on her slender frame. She looked smaller in the daylight, but not weaker. There was a stillness to her that spoke of endurance rather than fragility. She turned when she heard him, movements measured, cautious. Her eyes went to his face first, not his hands. That detail lodged itself in his chest and refused to move. "You didn't run," he said. She shook her head slowly. "You said you wouldn't follow." Kyle studied her, noting the faint tremor she tried to hide by clasping her hands together, the way her weight stayed balanced as though ready to move if necessary. She was afraid, yes, but not panicked. That made her dangerous in a different way. "You know who I am," he said. She hesitated, then nodded. "Alpha of Shadowclaw. No honorific, no reverence, no curse, just fact. And you know what happens if the Covenant believes I'm sheltering you." Her gaze didn't drop. "They already believe worse." Something tight pulled at his mouth, not quite a smile. He moved farther into the room, boots quiet against the floor. He didn't crowd her, but the space between them closed naturally, drawn by gravity neither of them named. Up close, he could see faint scars along her wrists, half hidden by the sleeves. Old. He felt a low, dangerous heat crawl up his spine. "Why run now?" he asked. "Why not before?" Her throat worked. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke, voice steady but thin, like ice stretched over deep water. "Because yesterday was the first day they stopped calling it a choice." The words landed harder than he expected. Kyle exhaled slowly. This wasn't a reckless girl chasing freedom. This was someone who had measured the cost and chosen it anyway. Varric went still, listening. "You understand I might still send you back," Kale said. "Not because I believe them. Because war costs lives." "I understand," she replied. Then, after a pause, softer, "I just hoped you wouldn't." Hope. He hated the word. It had ruined more wolves than blood ever had. He turned away before she could read his face. "You'll eat. Rhea will check your injuries. After that, we'll decide what happens." When he reached the door, her voice followed him, quiet, but firm. "Thank you." He didn't respond. Gratitude made things complicated.
Selene's point of view. He filled the room without trying to, not with noise or threat, but with presence. When he stepped closer, the air shifted, carrying the scent of pine resin and smoke and something darker beneath it. Not ritual, not incense, something alive, something unfiltered. Seline had been trained to read men in power, to anticipate moods before they turned sharp. Kale Draven was different. He did not perform authority. He wore it like bone under skin, inseparable, unadorned. That frightened her more than sermons ever had. When he spoke of sending her back, her stomach twisted, but she did not beg. Begging had been stripped from her long ago, filed down until obedience looked like gratitude. She would not wear that shape again. His gaze lingered on her wrists, and she felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with shame. It was the first time someone had looked at those scars without reverence or approval. Just recognition. It made her chest ache in a way she didn't yet understand. After he left, the room felt larger, emptier. She hadn't realized how much of her attention had been fixed on him until the door closed behind his broad frame. Her wolf stirred again, a low ripple of awareness that brushed against her thoughts. "Careful," came the faintest whisper. Not words exactly. More like instinct shaped into sound. Seline pressed a hand to her chest, breath hitching. Leora was closer now, awake enough to warn her. Rhea arrived later, gentle but efficient, her presence warm in a way Seline wasn't used to. She checked her ankle, cleaned the wound on her ribs, spoke casually as she worked, as though this were normal. As though Seline were normal. "You're safe here," the healer said, not as reassurance, but as statement. Seline nodded, though the word safe still felt like a language she was learning. When she was left alone again, she sat by the window and watched the pack move through the clearing below. Wolves laughing, arguing, living without prayer, without permission. Her chest tightened with something like grief for a life she'd never known. And somewhere below, she sensed him again. Kale. Moving with purpose, issuing orders, carrying the weight of a pack that trusted him without fear or worship. The awareness pulled at her, subtle but persistent, like a thread drawn too tight. She didn't understand it yet. She only knew that when he was near, the silence inside her shifted, and that frightened her almost as much as the idea of being sent back.
Chapter 4. What are you, little rabbit? Kale's point of view. Kale told himself he was checking on her because he needed information, that the Covenant did not release assets lightly, that no one raised in their sanctum crossed borders by accident, and that a girl with their brand on her skin was either bait or catastrophe. These were reasonable thoughts, sensible ones. He repeated them as he walked back toward the guest quarters, as though repetition might dull the unease curling under his ribs. It didn't. She was seated at the small table this time, a bowl of food untouched before her. The morning light no longer made her look breakable. It sharpened her instead, outlining the narrow line of her jaw, the quiet alertness in her eyes. She looked like someone who had learned to disappear by becoming very still, and the discipline of it was unsettling in a way Kale couldn't quite name. "You haven't eaten," he said, stopping just inside the room. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "I will." Not defensive, not submissive, just careful. Kale crossed his arms and leaned back against the wall, giving her space while taking up far too much of it anyway. His presence always did that. He watched her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, testing her tolerance for it. She didn't fidget, didn't avert her gaze. She simply waited, eyes tracking him with a quiet intensity that made his wolf shift restlessly beneath his skin. "You don't smell like a fanatic," he said at last. That got a reaction. A flicker of something crossed her face, quick and unguarded, like surprise tangled with something darker. "What do I smell like?" she asked. The question was a mistake. Kale knew it the instant it left her mouth. He felt it in the way the air between them tightened, charged with something unspoken. He should have deflected. Instead, he answered honestly. "Like fear that's been taught manners," he said. "And like someone who's been told her whole life what she is, without ever being asked." Her breath caught just slightly. She looked down then, not in shame, but as if the words had landed somewhere tender. Varric stirred again, a low growl of interest. "She is not weak," the wolf murmured. "She is contained." Kale pushed away from the wall and moved closer, stopping just short of invading her space. He could feel her awareness of him like heat, subtle but undeniable. It surprised him how sharply his body responded to it, how his attention narrowed until there was only her and the quiet thrum of something dangerous building between them. "You never answered my question from yesterday," he said. "Why you ran into my territory instead of anywhere else." She swallowed. "I didn't know it was yours." A pause. Then, more quietly, "I just knew it wasn't theirs." That answer sat with him longer than it should have. Kale studied her face. The fine lines of exhaustion etched beneath her eyes, the stubborn set of her mouth. This was not a girl chasing rebellion. This was someone fleeing annihilation. "What are you, little rabbit?" he asked, the words rougher than he intended. Her gaze snapped up at the nickname, something sharp flashing there, but it didn't turn into anger. It turned into resolve. "I'm not a bride," she said, "and I'm not sacred if that's what you're asking." It wasn't, not entirely. He straightened, tension coiling low in his spine. "Eat," he said instead. "You'll need your strength." When he turned to leave, he felt her eyes on his back, felt the pull of it like a hand almost touching, almost asking. He didn't look back.
Selene's point of view. He unsettled her in ways the prophet never had. The prophet's power had been loud, wrapped in ceremony and promises, always pressing, always demanding. Kale's was quiet, a gravity that pulled rather than pushed. It made her aware of herself in ways she wasn't prepared for, of how she sat, how she breathed, how the space between them seemed to hum when he moved closer. When he called her little rabbit, something in her bristled, not because it was demeaning, but because it was perceptive. He saw her as prey, yes, but not as something meant to be caught and consumed. More like something that had survived too long in a world designed to kill it. She forced herself to eat after he left, each bite grounding her further in this strange, ordinary reality. Food without blessing, water without prayer. It felt almost illicit, and the thought made her chest tighten with something like guilt. Then, slowly, that guilt began to unravel. Her wolf stirred again, more insistent now. Not words, not yet, but presence, awareness. Seline pressed her palm to the table, steadying herself as a faint warmth spread through her limbs, unfamiliar and unsettling. Later, she stepped outside for the first time since arriving. No guards stopped her. No eyes followed her with suspicion sharp enough to cut. The clearing opened before her, alive with movement and sound. Wolves laughed, argued, brushed past one another with easy familiarity. No one bowed, no one prayed. Kyle stood at the center of it, issuing instructions, his voice low and even. He didn't need to raise it. The pack listened because they trusted him, not because they feared divine punishment. The realization hit her harder than any sermon ever had. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up. Their eyes met across the distance, and the world seemed to narrow, the noise dulling to a low hum. She felt the pull again, stronger now, a thread drawn taut between them. It frightened her how much she wanted to step closer, to test what would happen if she crossed that invisible line. Kale held her gaze for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then he turned away, deliberately, as though refusing something he wasn't ready to name. Seline released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands trembled at her sides, not with fear this time, but with awareness, with curiosity, with something that felt dangerously close to wanting. And somewhere deep within her, Leora shifted, restless and alert, as if she too had noticed the alpha of Shadowclaw, and approved.
Chapter 5. Warbride or Bait? Kyle's point of view. The council waited, restless beneath the timbered roof of the hall. Their voices a low current of agitation that didn't quite reach Kyle's skin. He stood at the head of the room, arms crossed, mind already several steps ahead of the discussion. It wasn't new, this tension. They wanted clarity. Orders. They wanted him to be certain. But Kale had seen too much to believe in the luxury of certainty. She crossed the border wearing covenant white, Elias said finally, seated to his right, voice roughened by suspicion and a night without sleep. You should have turned her over before her shadow hit our soil. You know what this looks like? Kale didn't answer right away. He'd watched the girl, Seline, move through the clearing that morning, eyes wide but alert, posture tense but not afraid. She hadn't spoken to anyone, she hadn't fled. She'd stood at the edge of a world she'd been told to fear and watched it without blinking. She didn't come as a weapon, Kale said. Or if she did, she doesn't know she's won. That's worse, Elias muttered, chewing the inside of his cheek. Her wolf is dormant, Rhea added from the far side of the table. Buried deep. She's fractured in ways I've only seen in those broken by binding magic. She's not ready to be a threat. Kyle didn't like the word fractured. It made her sound like glass, but he had seen her strength in the quiet, in the stillness. It wasn't passive. It was deliberate. And if they come for her? Elias pressed. What then? You going to hide her under your bed? The remark drew a few low laughs from the others, but Kale didn't flinch. His gaze stayed steady. If they come here, they cross into Shadowclaw land. They know what that means. But do we? Someone else asked. A younger wolf whose name Kale barely remembered. Do we know what it means to take in one of theirs? One who was supposed to be married to their prophet? Kale's fingers curled slowly into fists, not from anger, but from something quieter, older. Memory stirred, edged in fire and failure. He had seen what blind belief could do. He wasn't interested in feeding it. She is not their bride, he said, the finality in his voice leaving no room for argument. She's in our care until I say otherwise. The discussion ended. It had to. His word held weight here, and even those who questioned it would not challenge him twice. But, as the room emptied, the pressure didn't lift. Kale knew this wasn't over. Not for them, not for her, and not for him. He left the hall without speaking, the cold air biting clean against his skin as he moved down the path toward the lodge. He hadn't meant to see her again so soon, but his feet knew the way too well already. She was sitting on the steps outside, knees drawn up, arms resting lightly on them, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested she hadn't heard the full conversation, but had sensed its weight all the same. She didn't turn as he approached. He stood behind her for a moment, watching the curve of her back, the way the breeze caught strands of her pale hair and lifted them softly, almost reverently. When he finally spoke, his voice came out lower than intended. You're making this harder than it should be. She didn't flinch. Because I'm still here? Because I don't know what to do with you.
Selene's point of view. The truth of it was, she hadn't expected to be allowed to stay this long. Every hour that passed without being bound and dragged back through the woods felt borrowed, stolen from a future that had never been meant for her. She sat on the steps not because it was warm, but because the cold kept her sharp, awake, grounded in the body she still wasn't entirely sure belonged to her. When she heard his voice behind her, that calm, coarse edge that always seemed to scrape something loose inside her chest, she didn't move. She just listened. The words didn't sting, not because they were kind, but because they were honest. Then send me back, she said, though she didn't mean it. She'd never meant anything less. He came closer, his boots slow against the packed dirt. She could feel his presence like heat along her spine. Not touching, but near enough that her wolf stirred again, alert and aware. You think I haven't thought about it? He asked, stepping past her and seating himself on the edge of the step, just low enough that they weren't quite side by side. If this turns to war, it won't be your blood that gets spilled first. She looked at him then, really looked, at the tension in his shoulders, the tightness at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't trying to frighten her. He was trying to make sense of something that had no clean answer. They never taught us what peace looked like, she said after a moment, her voice almost lost to the wind. Only obedience and sacrifice. He turned his head slightly, watching her from the corner of his eye. You think this is peace? No, she said. But it's not silence. Not like theirs. That seemed to catch him. She saw it in the way his jaw flexed, in the slight shift of his body toward her, a movement so subtle most wouldn't have noticed. But she had spent her life watching for movements that meant danger. This one meant something else, Not safety, but interest. Seline didn't lean in. She didn't retreat either. The space between them pulsed, quiet but charged. Her body remembered how it felt to be touched without choice. This was different. He didn't reach for her. He didn't even brush against her. But the weight of his nearness, the way his breath moved the air beside her, made her more aware of her skin than any touch ever had. She felt the warmth of her own pulse at her throat, her mouth suddenly dry. She looked away first, not because she was afraid, but because if she looked at him too long, something inside her might ask for more than safety. He didn't press her. Instead, he stood slowly, the movement fluid and easy. He glanced down at her, something unreadable flickering in his expression. Then he walked away, not rushed, not avoiding, but letting her be the one to stay or follow. She didn't know what she wanted, but for the first time in her life, she had been asked to choose. And the ache in her chest told her she wanted to choose something more than just survival.
Chapter 6. The collar comes off.
Seline's point of view. The room no longer felt like a cell, but she still treated it like one. She sat near the hearth, watching the fire devour the dry logs, letting the heat soak into her bare feet and up through her aching legs. The floor was stone, unadorned, not cold enough to bite, but hard enough to remind her where she was. This wasn't home. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it wasn't the temple. That alone made the silence tolerable. The tunic fit better now. Rhea had brought her another one, softer and darker in color, something that didn't reek of borrowed sanctity or white-stitched purity. The fabric moved when she did, nothing ceremonial about it. It made her feel less like a ghost and more like someone still inhabiting a body. She touched the inside of her wrist, the skin rubbed raw from old restraints, though no one had bound her in days. The bruises were fading, but the memory of pressure remained, phantom-like. Her wolf stirred again. No words, no clarity, just presence. Leora was awake, but wary. Seline didn't push her. The door opened softly behind her. She didn't look, but her body tensed. Not in fear, but in readiness. That tension unraveled almost immediately when she caught his scent. Smoke, pine, iron. Kyle. He said nothing at first, just stood near the threshold. She could feel him there, watching her, the way his gaze moved over her form without claim or hesitation. It wasn't the kind of look that demanded or devoured. It wasn't indulgent. It was steady. Real. "You don't sleep much," he said. She didn't turn. "Neither do you." He stepped forward, the sound of his boots deliberate against the stone. She didn't flinch, but her spine straightened slightly, not from fear, but from something far more complicated. He stopped a few paces behind her, his presence folding into the room like the closing of a door that shut out the rest of the world. "I brought something," he said, and from the corner of her eye, she saw the glint of metal. A collar. Not iron, leather, worn and too familiar. Her pulse stumbled. "I found this among the things you arrived with," Kyle said. "It was in your pack. You didn't bring much else." She looked at the collar, her breath thinning. It wasn't symbolic. It was functional. A training tool used in silence. Its weight had been around her neck more times than she could count, a sign of piety, of belonging, of submission. She hadn't even realized they'd sent it with her. Or perhaps she had, and her mind had folded the memory away in self-preservation. Kyle's voice was lower now, steady. "I wanted to give you the choice. You can burn it if you want, or keep it, or I can take it and get rid of it for you. But I won't decide for you." She turned her head toward him then, slowly, her gaze meeting his in the dim firelight. His face held no expectation, no judgment, just something patient, something careful. She stood, bare feet silent against the stone, and walked toward him. Her fingers reached out, closing around the collar with a pressure that trembled. Her wolf shifted again, close beneath her skin, not alarmed, curious. Seline held the collar between her hands for a long breath, studying its frayed edges, the indentation where the buckle had pressed into her throat. She moved past Kale, walked to the hearth, and dropped the collar into the fire. It hissed, curled, blackened. The leather cracked, the metal twisted. She didn't watch it burn. She watched Kyle, and he was already watching her.
Kale's point of view. He had brought the collar intending to see what she would do. Not to test her, not to provoke her, but to offer her a boundary she could erase on her own terms. What he hadn't expected was the heat that rolled through him when she met his gaze after tossing it into the fire. There had been no dramatic gesture, no tears, just a quiet, devastating finality in the way she looked at him afterward. Like she had already chosen to let it die, and now she was waiting to see if he would look at her differently. He didn't. He looked at her like something sharp and quiet had settled in his chest, and he wasn't sure how long it would stay there. She turned back to the hearth, her posture no longer defensive. The firelight painted her skin in warm, flickering tones, and he could see the lines of her arms now, the strength hidden in her stillness. She wasn't soft. She wasn't made for worship. She was made for endurance. And something about that made his wolf grow restless. He took a step forward and she didn't move. Another step. Closer now. Not enough to touch, but enough that her breath caught slightly, and the line of her throat shifted. "Do you want to stay?" he asked, voice lower than before. Not a command, not a coax, just the truth of a question that had waited too long. She nodded slowly, purposefully. His hand lifted before he could stop it, hovering near the edge of her hair. He didn't touch her, but he watched the way her eyes tracked the motion, the way her body stayed still, waiting, not with fear, but with readiness. "Then stay," he said, "but not as a prisoner." Her voice was quiet, steady. "Then don't treat me like one." "I'm not," he said. She looked at him like she almost believed it. And Kale realized that was the most dangerous part. He wanted her to believe it. More than he should. More than was safe. He turned away first because if he didn't, he wouldn't. The door closed behind him with a whisper, and the warmth of her silence followed him out. Chapter 7. Wolves Without Gods.
Selene's point of view. The fire burned lower by the time she lay down, but Seline didn't sleep. Her body was still, curled loosely beneath a thick wool blanket, yet her thoughts refused to settle. They wandered through the room like spirits trapped in wood, brushing past every memory she'd tried to bury beneath silence. She could still feel the weight of the collar on her neck, even though it was gone. Could still smell the smoke curling from its leather carcass as it crumbled into ash. But what lingered more than anything was the feeling of Kale standing behind her. Close, but not touching, watching her with a kind of tension that wasn't rooted in suspicion or threat. There had been something else in it, something slower, heavier, more human than holy. She stared at the wooden beams overhead, tracing the lines until her eyes blurred. It should have frightened her. Being here, in enemy territory, in a place she'd been raised to believe was godless, lawless, ruled only by force. But it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a quiet she didn't have to earn. A silence that didn't punish her for existing inside it. Her wolf stirred again, closer now. Leora's presence brushed the inside of her mind like a breath, not strong enough to speak yet, but no longer hiding. Seline welcomed her without fear. When the morning light finally broke across the room, she rose slowly, letting the day take her gently. She dressed in another tunic, this one a deeper shade of gray that matched the mist clinging to the forest beyond the lodge. No guards waited at her door. No orders were shouted. The only sound was the wind moving through pine and the faint murmurs of the pack in the distance. Outside, the cold greeted her like a memory she hadn't decided to keep. She stepped into it anyway, barefoot, toes pressing into the dirt path, as if to remind herself she was allowed to walk here without permission. She passed no one at first, though she caught the edge of a laugh carried on the wind, warm and unfamiliar. It didn't belong to her world, but she wanted to understand it. She followed the sound, drawn by instinct more than intent, and found herself at the edge of the training field. Wolves moved through drills with precision, but not fear. No chance, no incense, just motion, discipline, sweat. And Kyle, at the center of it all, not commanding from above, but moving through it like he belonged to it. He broke off when he saw her, eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing the moment, then nodding once without summoning her. She moved closer anyway.
Kale's point of view. He watched her from the corner of his eye as she stepped over the frost-hardened dirt, her movements hesitant but steady. The new tunic fell past her knees and her pale hair was braided loosely down one side, strands slipping free in the wind. She looked like a secret, still deciding whether to be spoken. His wolves didn't stop when she approached. Some of them looked, a few muttered, but no one challenged her. She'd been here long enough now to be a curiosity, not a threat. That too was dangerous. He didn't need the pack growing soft toward her. He didn't need himself growing soft. Still, when she reached the edge of the field and stood there, hands loose at her sides, he felt that same pull again, a thread drawn taut between instinct and reason. "You should eat before you pass out," he said without looking directly at her. "I ate," she answered, voice low. He turned then, not because her answer mattered, but because he needed to see her face. The wind had flushed her cheeks, and her lips were slightly parted, breath curling in the cold. Her eyes met his, clear but cautious, and for a moment neither of them moved. "You're not afraid of us," he said, and she tilted her head slightly. "Should I be?" That answer cut deeper than it should have, not because it challenged him, but because it didn't. She wasn't posturing. She was asking something he hadn't yet figured out how to answer. "Not yet," he said. She didn't smile. But something in her posture shifted, an easing of tension along her spine, a breath released that had been held too long. "Walk with me," he said. He didn't wait for her agreement. He turned and headed toward the tree line, knowing she would follow. She did. The woods were quieter than the field, insulated by snow-dampened branches and old earth. The trail they walked wasn't marked, but Kale knew it well, a path worn by his own need for space more than by any patrol. He didn't speak at first, neither did she. Their footsteps were soft, almost synchronized. Her presence beside him was more felt than seen, a quiet awareness that shifted with the rhythm of her breath. When he finally broke the silence, it wasn't with questions. "There are no gods here," he said, "if that's what you're looking for." "I'm not." The firmness of her voice surprised him. "Not anymore," she added after a moment. "They asked for too much and gave nothing back." Kale slowed his steps, glancing at her sideways. "So what do you believe in now?" "I don't know yet," she said, eyes on the trees ahead. "But I think it should feel less like surrender." The words lodged in his chest, simple but cutting. He thought of the collar and the fire, the way she'd stood before it burning like a witness to her own resurrection. They walked a little farther. The quiet between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like something waiting to be named. When they stopped, they were standing near the stream that split the forest, its edges frozen, but still moving beneath the ice. She stepped closer to the water's edge, watching it shimmer in the pale light. Kyle stayed behind her, just far enough that if she turned, she would have to look up to meet his eyes. She didn't turn, but he knew she felt him there. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "I'm not what they wanted," she said. And for the first time he wondered if maybe those two truths were the same. She stood in the cold like it didn't touch her, shoulders bare, skin flushed. He had the sudden, almost feral thought of brushing his hand along the braid at her shoulder, unweaving it slowly until her hair lay loose again. He didn't move. But the wanting lingered tight in his chest, coiled and unspoken. When they returned to the lodge, the air between them was warmer. Not softer, but warmer. Like the tension had shifted shape. Not gone, but changed. She didn't look back at him when she stepped inside. She didn't need to. And Kale stood at the threshold a little too long, feeling the pull of something he wasn't ready to resist. Chapter 8. Salt in the Wound. Kale's point of view. The scent reached him first. Foreign, sour, thick with the iron tang of magic that didn't belong in these woods. It clung to the eastern edge of his border like rot, as though the land itself rejected it. Kyle stood on the ridge just before dawn, eyes narrowed, wind threading through the loose strands of his hair, as he listened to the forest hold its breath. Behind him, Shadowclaw territory stirred slowly into motion, unaware of the message that had been left like a curse at their doorstep. A carcass lay at the base of a pine tree. Not a wolf, not prey, but a white fox, skinned with a ritualist's precision, its body split down the middle and sewn crudely back together with silver thread. Its fur was stained crimson and its eyes, still open, had been painted with ash. No signature, no writing, no need. He recognized the craftsmanship, if it could be called that. Covenant. It wasn't an offering, it was a warning, and an accusation. They had found her. The prophet didn't send wolves to retrieve what he believed was already his. He sent omens. Kale crouched beside the fox, silent, tension building behind his sternum. Varric rose in his mind like a shadow beneath the surface, snarling low. The message was clear. Seline hadn't escaped unnoticed. Her absence had become a myth already. And myths were more dangerous than prisoners. He burned the fox where it lay, scattering the ashes to the wind, and returned without ceremony. His thoughts moved faster than his footsteps, racing ahead to the moment he would have to tell her. He didn't want to see her shrink again. He didn't want to watch her fold in on herself the way she had when he'd first brought her in, but he couldn't keep this from her. When he reached the lodge, the door was half open. The fire had been rebuilt, warm and steady. She was at the window, arms crossed over her chest, head turned toward the morning light that filtered through the trees. She didn't hear him come in, or maybe she did and chose not to react. He closed the door behind him and waited. "You burned something," she said quietly. "I smelled the smoke." Kale stepped farther into the room. "They left it for me to find." Her hands tightened where they held her arms, though she didn't turn to face him. "What was it?" He hesitated for half a breath. "A fox. Ritual kill. Meant to draw a line." She was quiet, too quiet. He moved closer but kept his distance, letting the fire between them serve as the line she hadn't asked him to cross. "They think I was taken," she said, "and yes, by you." Yes, this time she turned. Her expression wasn't fearful. It was something colder, something brittle. "That means they're rewriting the story." "They're turning it into prophecy," Kale said. "You didn't just run. You were stolen. Which means now, you're worth more." She let out a breath that sounded like a laugh but felt nothing like one. He always said I'd be sacred in death if not in life. The bitterness in her voice was quiet but sharp, like glass ground into the soft parts of her throat. Kyle watched her closely, the set of her shoulders, the way her spine stayed straight even as her fingers curled tighter around her ribs. He hated the tension in her body, hated how familiar it was. "They're going to come," she said. "Not yet. Not until they've made it holy. But they will. I know. And when they do—" "I'll handle it," he said, not as a promise but as a fact. She looked at him then, eyes darker than he'd ever seen them. "It's not your war. It became mine the moment they marked me the villain." Her gaze didn't soften, but something in her shifted, barely perceptible. She didn't thank him. She didn't cry. She simply walked past him, slowly, stopping just near the hearth, where the last of the morning's warmth flickered. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "They'll call it betrayal, that I let myself be touched by someone unchosen, that I gave myself to the false wolf." Kale's breath hitched. Once, deep in his chest, a pause so subtle it didn't reach his face. Her words weren't accusation. They were warning and confession. He stepped closer. One step. Another. Slowly. She didn't move away. Her eyes stayed on the fire, but her attention shifted, full and immediate, drawn to the shape of him behind her. "You haven't given yourself to anyone," he said, voice low, quiet as falling ash. "Not here. Not yet." She turned her face toward him. Not fully. Just enough that he could see the reflection of the fire in her eyes. "But I will. Won't I?" Kyle said nothing. He didn't need to. The space between them was not empty. It was charged, alive, a tension strung so tightly it might snap if touched too soon. He didn't reach for her, but the wanting was there, coiled between them like a held breath. Seline moved first, not toward him but away, a step back, a breath collected. She didn't retreat. She reclaimed space, her body no longer curled inward. She stood straight, and for a moment, she looked taller. "Not yet," she repeated, "but I'm not afraid of later." Then she left the room quietly, leaving the door open behind her. Kyle remained by the fire, the echo of her scent curling in the air like smoke that refused to clear. His hand stayed at his sides, but every inch of him remained aware of where she had stood, of how her presence lingered like a bruise he wasn't ready to name. Varric moved inside him, slower now, quieter. No hunger, no claim. Just a low, steady hum of recognition. He wasn't touching her, but he was already holding something of hers, something wordless, something real. And he knew it was only a matter of time before the war found them both. Chapter 9. The False Wolf's Blood.
Elaine's point of view. The sound of her feet brushing along the path helped keep her thoughts quiet. Morning had long since passed, but the cold still clung to the ground in a pale frost that glittered along the edges of stone and grass. The wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth, unpolluted by incense or sacred smoke. It felt clean. It felt undeserved. She followed the path deeper into the eastern part of the territory, where few seemed to go without reason. No one had stopped her, not even Kale. There was a strange freedom in that, a strange terror, too. Choice meant responsibility. She had never known that weight until now. In the Covenant, you were guided, directed, shaped. Here, she was only watched, not controlled, not steered. She was becoming herself, and she didn't even know what that meant yet. Her hand drifted to the inside of her arm, where faint scars ran like forgotten stitching. The cold made them ache. She didn't hide them. There was no longer a reason to. Ahead, the trees parted into a small clearing. An old structure sat half sunk into the earth. Stone walls, partially collapsed, moss-covered, and forgotten. She didn't know what drew her there, only that her chest tightened with recognition before her mind caught up. This had been a temple once, or at least something like it, but no candles burned here. No holy texts lay on its cracked altar. She stepped inside, breath shallow, the silence not heavy, but still. And in the silence, something inside her shifted. Her fingers brushed the edge of the stone, and memory rose unbidden. Not from her own life, but from something older, deeper. The echoes of prayers spoken by wolves long dead. She saw flashes, blood on hands, silver coins pressed into eyes, names carved into the walls in languages no longer spoken. She backed away slowly, her heartbeat steady but fast. Her wolf stirred sharply at the base of her spine, and for the first time, Seline heard her. "Not theirs." The voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. Female, sharp-edged, awake. Seline turned, heart hammering now for a different reason, and walked quickly back toward the lodge, her breath a thin stream of frost in the morning air. Not theirs, not the prophets, not the moons. If not theirs, then whose?
Kale's point of view. He found her pacing the lodge an hour later, tension rolling off her in waves too subtle for any ordinary wolf to catch. But Kale wasn't ordinary. He watched the way her hands moved restlessly, the way she kept returning to the window and not looking through it, as if the outside had started pressing too close. She didn't speak when he entered, just stopped moving, and her shoulders settled only a little. He moved to the far wall, reached for the half-finished bottle of dark root tonic he'd left the night before, and poured a slow measure into a chipped clay cup. He drank it without grimacing. Then he spoke. "There's something I haven't shown you." She turned to face him then, her expression unreadable. He didn't ask if she wanted to see it. He simply nodded toward the door and stepped outside. She followed without hesitation. They didn't speak as they moved through the trees. The sun had dipped lower, light golden and slanted, filtering between the branches like a breath half-held. Her steps were steady, but Kyle noticed the way she stayed just a pace behind, always watching. She wasn't afraid. She was assessing. He respected that. He led her beyond the clearing, down a path overgrown with brush, until they came to a smaller den hidden behind a thicket of old thorn. A ruin, almost, half buried in the hill, but the entrance remained intact. He stepped aside so she could see it. "This belonged to one of ours," he said. "A wolf exiled over a decade ago. A heretic by covenant standards." She said nothing, but he saw the flicker of interest in her eyes. He opened the door and let her enter first. Inside, the air was cold and dry. The room was small, one room only, a desk, long decayed, shelves along the walls, scrolls and texts stacked in disorganized piles, all preserved by isolation. It didn't smell of rot. It smelled of dust and old ink. Truths no one had touched. Seline stepped forward slowly, fingertips brushing along one of the shelves. Her breath caught. Kyle waited. "They wrote in high script," she murmured. "You can read it?" "Enough to recognize the dialect. This isn't covenant text." "No, it predates them." She picked up one of the scrolls, slowly unrolling it, revealing a diagram etched in sharp, curling symbols. A tree with two wolves on either side, one cloaked in shadow, one in moonlight. At the center, a spiral of blood. Kyle moved closer, his voice low. "This is where we found the first mention of the false wolf." She didn't look at him. Her eyes were locked on the spiral. "They said it was prophecy, that the false wolf would corrupt the sacred line, fracture the divine blood." Kale nodded. "But this isn't prophecy, it's warning. The original texts speak of balance, not divinity." She looked up at him then slowly, her voice almost a whisper. "You're the one they named, but not because you were evil. Because you were outside their control. Because I didn't kneel, Kyle said, and something in him clenched when he saw her expression shift. Not in fear, but in understanding. The fire in her eyes hadn't been there before, but it was there now. It changed the air between them, made it warmer, heavier. Her hand lowered the scroll back onto the desk. She turned toward him fully. And what am I then? He didn't answer immediately. He stepped forward, 1 pace, 2. The space between them vanished like breath on glass. His voice, when it came, was quieter than it had ever been. Maybe the one who stops running. The silence after that was thick, laced with breath and heat and questions neither of them voiced. She didn't move back. He didn't close the space further, but the tension coiled between them, deeper than desire, older than recognition. And neither one of them looked away. Chapter 10. Her first shift.
Selene's point of view. The ache began before dawn, low in her spine, dull and strange, pulsing with a rhythm that didn't match her own heartbeat. It wasn't pain exactly. It was anticipation, like a storm pressing against the inside of her skin. She curled tighter beneath the heavy blanket, face half buried in the coarse wool, waiting for the sensation to pass. It didn't. It deepened. Each breath brought a faint shimmer beneath her ribs, an internal pressure, warm and rising. Leora was awake now, fully and undeniably. Her presence no longer brushed gently at the edges of Selene's mind. She pressed inward, restless, silent still, but too loud to ignore. For so many years, Selene had moved through the world without her. The silence had become part of her. Now, her own skin felt too small. She rose from the bed slowly, bare feet meeting the floor with a kind of caution that came from not knowing what she might become. The lodge was dark, quiet, the fire low in its cradle. A breeze slipped in through the shuttered window, brushing her skin with a chill that sharpened her thoughts. Her limbs felt heavy, not with fatigue, but with something building, like the body she wore wasn't hers entirely anymore. She moved to the door, hesitated only briefly, then slipped outside into the pre-dawn cold. The frost stung at first, then faded as something warmer unfurled through her veins. The woods called to her. Not in the way the covenant had described, no sacred whispers, no divine pull, but in the way a body seeks water after thirst. She moved without direction, her breath thick in the air, the trees opening before her as if they knew who she was now becoming. She didn't hear Kale behind her until he was too close to ignore.
Kale's point of view. He had felt her leave. Not through a bond, not through instinct shaped by ritual, but through something simpler, awareness. He had been awake before the sun, staring into the embers of a fire he hadn't tended, knowing she would move. And when she did, he followed. And she walked like someone chasing the edge of something she couldn't name. Barefoot, hair loose, face lifted slightly as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. The moment she stepped into the grove just beyond the north ridge, he knew. Her wolf was coming forward. He stayed at the edge of the clearing far enough not to intrude, close enough to act if something went wrong. He had seen first shifts before. He had seen them tear through flesh and bone with no control, no grace. But Seline stood in the center of the frost-dusted field, her breath slow, hands at her sides, body trembling with something deeper than fear. He didn't speak. She turned to him once, eyes wide, not with panic but with warning. "I don't know how," she said, voice shaking. "You don't need to," Kyle answered. "She already does." Her mouth opened as if to reply, but her breath hitched, and then her knees buckled. She caught herself with one hand, the other pressed to her stomach as her back arched. A low sound left her throat, somewhere between a cry and a growl. Her body began to shimmer, not with light, but with heat. as though the very air around her had thickened. Kale stepped forward, slow, deliberate, his wolf pulsing behind his ribs, sensing the change. Selene's fingers curled into the frozen grass, her head dropped forward. Her breath came faster now, and her body twisted with the first wave of the shift. Bones didn't snap. They sang. Muscles stretched, skin shivered, and then she split. Not violently, not with the chaos of a forced transformation, but like something soft giving way to something sharp and true. Her wolf emerged. Leora was smaller than most, built for speed, not power. Silver-gray fur rippled over lean muscle, her frame compact but coiled with energy. Her eyes, Selene's eyes, were bright with clarity, not confusion. She landed on 4 paws and stood still, chest heaving, steam rising from her flanks. Kale remained motionless. He met Leora's gaze, held it, let her see him fully, not as a threat, not as a captor, as a witness. Her ears flicked, her tail lowered. She didn't growl. She didn't run. She paced once, then twice, then moved toward him, not fast, but without hesitation. When she reached him, she didn't bow or submit. She pressed her muzzle against his hand. Kyle exhaled slowly, letting his finger slide into her fur, feeling the tremble beneath. She was still trembling. The shift had left its mark, but she was standing. "You did it," he said. She didn't shift back. She didn't need to. They stood there, the two of them in the half-light of a new morning, and though no words passed between them, something older than language moved in the silence. Something heavy with promise. She had become, and he had seen her. Chapter 11. Between Teeth and Trust.
Selene's point of view. The shift had not broken her, it had opened her. When the bones reshaped and the skin gave way, it was not agony that tore through her body, but relief. A return. A remembering. The first breath taken in wolf form had felt like the first real breath of her life. It had not been clean or graceful, not the controlled, holy ritual she'd always been told it would be. It had been messy, trembling, raw, but hers, entirely, defiantly hers. Leora had not spoken, not in words, but her presence had been loud. She had surged forward like a tide that had waited too long, stretching into muscle and sinew with an aching joy that left Selene weak with something closer to awe than exhaustion. There had been no divine light, no whispered blessings, just the quiet sound of wind threading through the trees and the steady heartbeat of the man who had not turned away. Even now, hours later, wrapped in a thick blanket by the hearth once more, the sensation lingered. Her limbs were sore in ways she didn't know how to describe. Her breath slower than usual, her body humming with residual power. But beneath all of that, there was something new in her chest. Heavy and quiet. Kale had not touched her when she shifted back, only offered the warmth of his coat and a space to steady herself. He had led her through the trees in silence, not guiding her like someone fragile, but walking beside her like someone who belonged. And when they'd returned to the lodge, he'd left her without a word, closing the door behind him as though to give her space to breathe as herself. She sat now with her knees pulled up beneath her chin, staring into the fire with half-lidded eyes, her body draped in layers, her mind wide open. She should have been afraid. The shift should have frightened her or left her disoriented. Instead, she felt more solid, more whole, as if every cell had reoriented itself around a new truth. She had a wolf. She had always had her, and now she was awake. Seline turned slightly, gaze drifting toward the window, and caught sight of Kale again, his figure standing alone at the edge of the clearing, back straight, arms folded, watching the wind move through the trees like it might speak if he stood still long enough. He looked like someone built to carry weight. She'd sensed that in him from the first moment. But now it felt different. It no longer unsettled her. It steadied her. She rose without really deciding to, moving toward the door with a grace that hadn't been there yesterday. Her steps were lighter, more certain, her breath easier. She opened the door and crossed the threshold, like she wasn't asking permission anymore.
Kale's point of view. He heard her before he saw her, the soft whisper of her steps on the frozen ground, the shift in the air around her, the way his wolf stirred before his mind registered anything else. Varric did not speak, not aloud, but Kale felt the change in him, a quiet pulse of attention that hadn't been there before. He turned. She walked toward him slowly, wrapped in a blanket, her hair loose and windswept, her face bare of paint or fear. Her eyes had changed, not their color but their weight. She held herself like someone who had nothing left to prove. He said nothing. She stopped a few feet away, the blanket pulled around her shoulders, her hands buried in the folds of it. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of what had not been said, full of the echo of her shift, of the quiet sounds her body had made when it surrendered to instinct, and the way she had looked at him afterward like she was seeing him for the first time. I thought it would feel like being torn apart, she said, voice low. But it didn't. It felt like coming home. Kale nodded once, not in agreement, but in understanding. She took another step toward him, and the distance closed without him meaning to move. She was close now, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her skin through the thin barrier of the blanket, could see the faint pink still clinging to her cheeks from the cold. I was never allowed to ask questions, she said softly. But now I have too many, and no one to ask. Then ask me. The words left his mouth before he could temper them, before he could remember that offering himself came with consequences. But she didn't flinch. She looked at him like she had expected him to say it, like she had waited. Why did you stay, she asked. In the clearing, you could have left me to shift alone. Kale's gaze held hers, steady, unreadable. Because no one should come into themselves alone. She looked at him for a long moment, then she let the blanket fall. It dropped around her feet like mist, slow and silent, revealing the simple clothes beneath. The tunic, the leggings, her bare arms pale against the winter light. She didn't move. She didn't shiver. She simply stood there, eyes open, waiting. It wasn't a gesture of seduction. It wasn't submission. It was the softest kind of defiance. Letting herself be seen without the shell, without the armor, without the fear that had ruled her every breath for years. Kyle didn't touch her. But something in him broke. Not in the way that pain breaks a man, in the way that silence breaks when the first sound enters, in the way still water breaks when light hits it. He reached for the edge of the blanket where it lay on the ground, lifted it slowly, and placed it back around her shoulders without a word. His fingers brushed her collarbone, briefly, just skin against skin, and her breath caught. Not sharply, not an alarm. It was a pause, an acknowledgement. She looked up at him, and the distance between them shrank without anyone moving. You can stop running, he said. Her voice came back softer than before. Only if I know you won't chase. Kyle's mouth tilted slightly, not a smile, but close. I won't. And in the quiet that followed, something shifted again. Between them, not around them. A gravity that had been pulling at them in silence finally settled. Not claimed. Not taken. But chosen. And for the first time in her life, Seline felt that choosing wasn't another word for being owned. It was a beginning. Chapter 12. The Moon Lied.
Selene's point of view. The rain came quietly in the early hours of the morning, soft and steady, dripping from the eaves of the lodge and pooling in the earth outside like spilled thoughts. Seline stood at the edge of the doorway, half wrapped in one of the wool blankets Rhea had left folded by the hearth. Her hands clutched the fabric loosely, her eyes on the silver threads of water sliding down the wooden railing. The world looked washed raw beneath the clouds, stripped of ceremony and reduced to sound and scent and weight. She hadn't returned to bed after Kale placed the blanket around her. She'd sat by the fire long after he'd left, her body warm, but her thoughts still moving like wind through hollowed bone. She'd felt the nearness of something between them, something not yet spoken, and it sat in her chest like a second heartbeat, steady and real. He hadn't touched her again, but she could still feel where his hand had brushed her skin. Now, as the rain kissed the land with its hush, she breathed deeper than she had in days. Her lungs didn't sting. Her throat didn't burn. There was no incense in the air. No whispers of prophecy slipping through doorways, reminding her what she was meant to be. She was not meant. She was here. And now she wanted to know what had been kept from her. She left the lodge without shoes, her feet sinking into the damp soil, the cold a necessary bite to keep her awake. The small ruin Kale had shown her still lingered in her mind. Those crumbling stones, the forgotten texts, the spiral between two wolves. Something had stirred in her when she'd seen it. Not memory, but recognition. She followed the edge of the woods until she reached the hill again, ducking beneath the heavy brush and slipping inside the old den. The air smelled of dust and the faint metallic edge of old ink. The texts hadn't been moved. She crouched near the shelves and pulled another scroll from the pile, this one older, darker along the edges. It unrolled with a sigh. The symbols were familiar in shape, but not in order. She scanned them slowly, mouth dry. Lines spoke of the goddess's silence, of the false light of the prophet, of wolves born with the power to sever what had been called divine. She read those words twice, then 3 times. Her pulse grew louder in her ears. They had rewritten everything. The moon had not chosen. The goddess had not spoken. It had always been a cycle of control dressed in sacred language. She leaned forward, one hand pressed against the floor to steady herself, the other tracing the ink with cautious fingers. Her heart didn't race. It slowed, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing. Everything she had been told was a lie designed to keep her small. Her wolf stirred, not in anger, but with something close to satisfaction. Leora did not howl. She did not rage. She only pressed forward, settled deeper into Selene's bones, as if confirming something that had long waited for air. When Selene rose, her body felt heavier in the right ways. Her spine straightened. Her breath deepened. The truth hadn't broken her. It had given her shape.
Kale's point of view. He felt the shift in the forest before she returned. The pack moved the same as always. Voices at the training fields, the usual rhythm of patrol rotations. But the air around him carried a weight he hadn't known he was waiting for. Not threat, not tension, something else. Like something uncoiled beneath the surface and began to move freely for the first time. He stood just outside the council hall, watching the fog lift in slow spirals from the trees. Rhea had passed by an hour earlier with nothing more than a raised brow. The question of Selene's whereabouts left unspoken. Kyle hadn't needed to ask. He knew where she'd gone, and when he saw her walking back from the forest, hair damp from the rain, feet bare, eyes wide with quiet certainty, he knew something in her had changed. She didn't slow when she saw him. She walked straight toward him, water clinging to her clothes, her steps purposeful, her gaze clear. He had seen wolves return from bloodshed with less fire in their eyes. He stepped forward to meet her, his voice low, steady. "You read more." She nodded. There was no hesitation in her now, no trace of the girl who had once flinched from the sound of her own name. Her presence struck him in the chest like heat from a fire that had been banked too long. "They twisted it," she said. "The prophecies, the goddess, all of it. They took real stories and bent them into a cage." "I know." She looked up at him, jaw tight, breath trembling. "They told me I was chosen, that it was an honor, that to be given to the prophet was sacred." Kale's hands curled into fists at his sides. He didn't interrupt. She needed to say it. "But I was never chosen," she went on. "I was just made, crafted to fit their narrative. It was never about destiny. It was about control." Kale reached out slowly, his hand brushing her damp hair from her face. His fingers moved with restraint, but there was no hiding the way his breath shifted at the contact. Her skin was cool, rain-slicked, soft beneath the roughness of his touch. She didn't pull away. "I believe you," he said. Her eyes searched his, and for the first time, she seemed to find what she was looking for there. Not comfort, not protection, recognition. Something passed between them, stronger than desire, sharper than warmth. It threaded through her chest, pulled tight and aching, but not painful, just real. Kale's hand drifted down along her jaw, his thumb resting just beneath her chin. Her breath stilled, her body tilting subtly toward his without command. He felt it, the question in her silence, the wanting in her stillness, but he didn't move further. He let the moment hang between them, unbroken, unfulfilled, and full of promise. She closed her eyes just for a second, as if to let the tension settle deeper. When she opened them again, her voice was steadier than it had ever been. "I'm not going back." Kale's voice met hers without hesitation. "I won't let them take you." They stood in the rising light of the new day, the ground still wet beneath their feet, the weight of truth between them, not a burden, but a tether. And in the silence that followed, her hand found his. Not in fear, not in desperation, but in choice. They said the moon had chosen her, but Seline had chosen herself, and Kale, in that stillness, chose her too. Chapter 13. A Godless Sanctuary.
Seline's point of view. The rhythm of the pack had become a distant echo to her, something felt rather than followed. She walked among them now, with eyes wide open, no longer searching for escape routes or memorizing the placement of sentries. Her body had begun to remember how to exist without tight corners or watchful eyes pressing in. She no longer flinched when doors closed behind her. She no longer measured her breath by the pauses in others' voices. The sun sat low in the sky, draping gold across the pines, softening the hard lines of the Shadowclaw stronghold. A breeze moved through the trees, gentle but insistent, threading through the loose strands of her hair. The air was clean, no scent of burning herbs, no blood mixed with sacred oils, no iron bite of altar stones, just pine, damp soil, wolves, and firewood smoke. She stood near the edge of the clearing, watching the others move in and out of the low cabins that ringed the open space. They weren't bowed in prayer. They weren't hushed by fear. They were laughing, shouting, existing, and the noise didn't hurt. It felt like warmth soaking through old bruises, like something sore learning how to stretch. Kyle stood across the field, speaking to two younger warriors, his head slightly bent, arms crossed. He didn't command with raised voice or spectacle. When he moved, others shifted without hesitation, not because they feared punishment, but because his presence anchored them. That strength had struck her once as cold. Now she understood it for what it was: consistency. She turned toward the edge of the forest, letting her feet carry her past the tree line, where the light filtered softer and the world narrowed into branches and birdsong. She had no destination in mind. Her body simply wanted motion, her wolf content to follow the scent of soil and growing things. Leora was quiet now, not dormant, but calm, like a heartbeat beneath water. Not far from the clearing, she found a wide patch of moss beneath the curve of a birch tree. She sank to the ground slowly, stretching her legs and pressing her palms into the cool green beneath her. This place was wild in a way that made her feel steady. There were no holy markers here, no carvings, no symbols. Just life growing without permission. She laid back, the blanket she'd carried tucked behind her head, eyes fixed on the slivers of sky through the branches. For a moment, she let herself drift, not asleep, but weightless, her mind quiet. When she heard the footsteps, she didn't tense. She knew the way he moved.
Kale's point of view. He had watched her cross the field with a stillness he didn't often allow himself. There was something in the way she carried herself now, something that made his pulse slow and deepen. Not because she was fragile, but because she wasn't pretending anymore. He had seen so many wolves wear strength like a mask. Seline didn't. Her strength had been earned in silence, in blood, in the quiet rooms where no one had come to save her. And now it was blooming. He gave her space, he always did. But when she passed into the trees, something in him stirred. Not possessive, not territorial. He didn't follow to guard. He followed because some part of him refused to stay behind. When he reached the edge of the birch grove, he saw her, stretched out on the moss, eyes turned to the sky, her expression unguarded in a way that struck him in the ribs. She didn't move when he stepped closer. She didn't rise. She simply turned her head slightly, acknowledging him, and returned her gaze to the clouds. He lowered himself beside her, slow and measured, resting one forearm across his bent knee. The silence was companionable. It didn't press. It didn't demand. It simply held them both. She looked at him then, eyes unreadable but soft around the edges. "Did you ever believe in gods?" "No," he said. "I believed in power, and in what wolves do with it." Her gaze flickered downward, thoughtful. "That's what I used to believe too, that gods were just stories made to justify control. But now," her voice thinned slightly, "now I think the story was never about gods at all. Just wolves who forgot how to let themselves be free." Kyle didn't reply. He looked at her, the pale line of her throat, the subtle movement of her breath. Her body was relaxed, but her words were not weightless. "You're free now," he said quietly. She turned her head again, eyes meeting his. "I'm not sure I know what that means yet." Kyle reached out, fingers brushing a fallen leaf from her collarbone, slow and deliberate. Her skin warmed beneath the touch, and her lips parted slightly. He let his hand rest there for a breath too long, not claiming, not testing, just existing in that space. "It means you get to choose," he said. Her throat moved when she swallowed, and her eyes never left his. "And what if I don't know what to choose yet?" "Then you take your time." His hand slid away slowly, not because he wanted to remove it, but because restraint was a language he had learned the hard way. She shifted then, just enough to close the small distance between them, her shoulder brushing in his, her head tilting until it rested lightly against his arm. Kale stilled, his breath caught somewhere between control and something far older, far deeper. The wind moved through the trees, stirring the leaves above them like soft breath over skin. Her presence beside him was not tentative. It was solid, real. Her nearness didn't ask for anything. It offered something instead. Trust. She didn't say another word, and neither did he. But the space between them no longer felt like distance, and it felt like the beginning of something they were both finally ready to hold. Chapter 14. The Alpha's Scar.
Selene's point of view. The warmth of him lingered long after they returned from the grove. She could still feel the place where her shoulder had rested against his arm, could still remember the quiet rhythm of his breath and the way the world had receded while the trees swayed above them. She hadn't spoken again after leaning into him. He hadn't moved away. The silence between them had felt full instead of empty, like an unspoken agreement neither of them needed to name. She carried that stillness with her now as she moved through the quieter corridors of the lodge. The rain had faded by the time dusk returned. Candlelight flickered softly in the narrow hallways, casting long shadows on the wooden walls. She passed a few wolves in the passage, none of them speaking, none of them stopping her. Her presence had become a part of this place in a way she hadn't expected. There were no more second glances, no more wary eyes tracking her movements. She had become something more than tolerated. But Kale still watched her differently. He hadn't touched her since the grove, not more than that leaf-brushing contact, but the heat in his gaze had been unmistakable. It was never hungry, never threatening. It was the kind of heat that burned steady and patient, like something deep underground waiting for the right time to surface. She felt it whenever he was near, and it stirred things in her she didn't fully understand. Tonight, she sought him without planning to. Her feet carried her toward the quiet side of the lodge where she'd seen him disappear earlier, his posture tighter than usual, his expression unreadable. She paused at the door, listened for a moment, then knocked softly. There was a long silence, then his voice from inside, low but clear. "Come in." She opened the door and stepped inside. Kyle sat near the far wall, hunched slightly forward, his shirt discarded over the back of a chair, a shallow basin of water at his side. A deep, ragged scar ran diagonally across his back from shoulder to rib, old but still angry beneath the skin. He had been cleaning it without urgency, as though the pain it carried had long since dulled to memory. He didn't turn. He didn't hide it. Seline closed the door quietly behind her and stood there for a moment, the room dim except for the fire crackling low in the hearth. The air smelled of pine wood and faint iron. She stepped closer slowly, the sound of her bare feet soft against the floor. Her eyes stayed fixed on the scar. "Who did that to you?" she asked, her voice barely louder than the fire. Kale didn't answer right away. His hands rested on his thighs, his body relaxed but unmoving. When he finally spoke, the words came without inflection. "My father." She hadn't expected that. Her breath stilled. "He wasn't a believer," Kale said, "but he believed in obedience, the kind that's beaten in, bone deep." She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her body moved instinctively, kneeling beside him with slow, careful grace. She reached for the cloth in the basin, wrung it out gently, then laid it across the scar with a touch that didn't tremble. His back rose slightly beneath her hand, not in pain, but in response. He didn't pull away. "I was 17, he continued. "He told me I wasn't meant to lead, that I questioned too much, disobeyed too easily. He said if I ever defied him again, he'd cut me deeper." Her hand stilled. The water dripped from the cloth in quiet rhythm. "He didn't get the chance," Kale said. Seline didn't ask what that meant. She understood without needing the rest of the story. She had seen the kind of silence left behind by power misused. She knew the way cruelty could wear a father's voice and still speak like a god. She dipped the cloth again, this time moving slower. The scar was rough, but the skin around it had healed clean. She followed its path with quiet precision, her fingers trailing behind the damp cloth, not tracing pain, but recognizing it. "I used to wonder," she murmured, "if the scars we couldn't see would ever stop bleeding." Kyle's head lowered slightly, his breath moving heavier now. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Her hand paused at his shoulder. She rested it there, just long enough for the weight of her touch to say what she couldn't. He turned toward her then, slowly, and their eyes met in the soft flicker of the firelight. The distance between them shrank, not with urgency, but with something deeper. His hand reached up, found her waist, anchored her with a grip that was firm but careful. Her breath caught, not in fear, but in anticipation. Their faces hovered close, too close to ignore, too far to satisfy. Her lips parted slightly. His thumb brushed the hem of her shirt, not lifting it, not pulling, just touching, as if asking without words. She leaned in, not fast, not slow, until her forehead rested against his. Their breaths mingled. Her hand slid from his shoulder to the side of his face, fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered. His voice came back low, rough at the edges. "You should be." But she knew he didn't mean it. She could feel it in the way his fingers trembled slightly against her skin. Not from restraint, from wanting. Still, he didn't kiss her, and she didn't press forward. They stayed like that, suspended in heat and quiet. Two bodies tethered by tension and trust, by something that had grown too real to name and too fragile to rush. The fire crackled beside them, and outside, the rain began again, soft and steady. Neither of them moved, but everything between them had changed.
Chapter 15. Blood in the Pines.
Selene's point of view. The air shifted before the sound came. It was subtle at first, just a ripple moving through the treetops, a hush that didn't belong to wind or rain. Seline stood near the edge of the eastern trail, the basket in her hands nearly forgotten. She had come to gather herbs Rhea had marked earlier that week, small clusters of root and moss that grew only beneath a certain kind of tree bark, but her instincts pulled her gaze away from the ground now. Her fingers curled tighter around the handle, not in fear, but readiness. Leora stirred inside her with a low growl of warning. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The forest ahead of her had gone still. Seline took a careful step backward, then another. Her breath moved shallow in her throat, her heart pacing itself without panic. This wasn't the kind of danger she had been raised to fear. It wasn't divine wrath or holy consequence. This was real, blood-warm, and close. Someone was watching. The sound broke cleanly then, a sharp crack of wood under pressure, followed by a rush of movement through the underbrush. She didn't wait to see. She dropped the basket and turned, sprinting toward the clearing, not clumsy or desperate, but focused, her body remembering how to move now that it belonged fully to her again. The first howl rose behind her, high and guttural, not from Shadow Claw. She knew their voices now. This was different, leaner, thinner, wrong in a way she couldn't name. She ran harder. The trees blurred past her, the scent of pine sharp in her lungs. Her muscles burned, but she didn't slow. The lodge came into view just as another figure burst from the woods behind her. She caught the glint of teeth, the gleam of pale fur streaked with black markings, and the echo of something sickly sweet, incense, faint but unmistakable. Covenant. Her wolf surged forward. She dropped into a low slide across the gravel, rolled once, and shifted mid-motion. Leora exploded from beneath her skin with no hesitation, no pain, only fire. Silver fur, sharp claws, ears pinned. She turned with a snarl and met the incoming wolf head-on. Their bodies collided with a crack of force that shook the earth.
Kale's point of view. The scent hit him before the scout did. Blood, foreign and familiar, thick with the iron rot of something old and sanctified. Kale turned before the warning reached his ears, already halfway to the eastern ridge when the howl echoed again. He recognized it now, too clean, too controlled. A Covenant-trained wolf. He hadn't heard that sound in years. He broke into a run without orders, without thought. Varric surged behind his ribs, rage simmering beneath the surface. They had crossed the line, not to threaten, to take. He reached the edge of the clearing just in time to see her. Silver and fast, her body a blur as she collided with the intruder. They tumbled, claws flashing, teeth snapping. The other wolf was larger, heavier, built for brutality, but Seline moved with precision, with purpose. She wasn't wild. She was trained. She darted left, tore upward, and sank her teeth into the flank of the larger wolf with a precision that startled even Kale. The male yelped, staggered, but didn't retreat. He lunged again, teeth bared for her throat. Kale was already shifting before his feet left the ground. Varric hit the clearing like a shadow split from the trees, black fur bristling, eyes sharp and ice pale. He struck the Covenant wolf from the side, sending the body flying against a tree with a sound like breaking bone. The wolf hit the ground, struggled up, then froze. Recognition passed between them. Kale sent his markings, the shape of him unmistakable. The intruder turned and fled. Seline didn't follow. Varric stood over her, breathing hard, his body tense. Leora lifted her head, blood streaking her muzzle, her eyes locked on his. She didn't bow. She didn't look away. Instead, she stepped forward. Their bodies touched. Not forcefully, not with dominance, but with something else. A slow brush of shoulder to chest, a breath shared in the hollow between tension and calm. Her heartbeat echoed beneath her fur, fast but steady. Varric lowered his head, not to claim her, but to acknowledge her. She had not needed saving, but he had come anyway.
Seline's point of view. The shift back came with a different kind of heat. Her body reformed beneath the moonlight, slick with sweat, trembling, her skin stinging with the remnants of the fight. The clearing had gone quiet now. Kale stood near the tree line, already returned to his human form, his chest bare, his body streaked with dirt and blood that was not his own. She rose slowly, one hand pressed to her side. The wound was shallow, already beginning to close. Leora buzzed beneath her skin, proud, silent, alive. Kale stepped toward her, not rushed, but with intent. His eyes moved over her carefully, checking, measuring, not for weakness, but for pain. When he reached her, his hand rose, fingers brushing her jaw, then lower to her collarbone, pausing at the bruised curve where the Covenant wolf's teeth had scraped. "You held your ground," he said, his voice rough. She didn't answer. Her body was still humming, still hot with the remnants of adrenaline and something heavier. She didn't step back. "You moved like you've done this before." Seline's throat tightened. "We were taught to obey and to defend what was theirs. But not yourself?" She shook her head slowly. He exhaled, jaw flexing once. Then his hand moved, tracing down her arm, stopping just above her wrist, where her pulse throbbed strong. Now you do, he said. Her body leaned toward him before her mind gave permission. She felt it again, that warmth, that gravity. Her breath caught. The fight had cleared something between them, burned it down to its bones. Kale didn't kiss her, but his hand curved around the back of her neck, his forehead met hers, and the world narrowed to breath and skin and the space between heartbeats. Seline closed her eyes and for the first time let herself stay.
Chapter 16. They think she's dead.
Seline's point of view. The fire crackled low in the hearth, throwing quiet shadows across the stone floor. Seline sat curled beneath a blanket, the heat from the flames brushing the curve of her bare feet, though it did little to melt the chill settling behind her ribs. Her body still ached from the fight, dull bruises blooming along her ribs and thighs, the faint sting of reopened memories sharper than any wound. She hadn't slept. Her eyes drifted closed at times, her body softened into stillness, but sleep stayed just out of reach, always pulled back by the lingering touch of teeth at her throat, the scent of sanctified blood, the whisper of loyalty twisted into obedience. She had known they would come. She hadn't expected how much of herself would rise up to meet them. Not with fear, with fury. The wolf inside her no longer crouched beneath the surface. Leora was still now, but present, quiet, not because she was hidden, but because she was watching, calm after the storm. Seline could feel the steadiness in her bones, the newfound certainty threaded through every motion. She had not run, she had not faltered, and Kale had seen it. That truth lived in her more deeply than she had words to carry. He had watched her fight, and still chosen to stand beside her. The sound of footsteps pulled her gaze toward the door. She didn't rise. She didn't need to. She knew the weight of his stride now, the way he filled a room before he ever spoke. Kyle entered with Rain still clinging to the collar of his shirt, the scent of earth and iron clinging to his skin. His jaw was tight, his mouth a darker line than usual. He held a folded piece of parchment in one hand. She sat straighter, blanket slipping lower on her shoulders. "What is it?" Her voice was steady, but her pulse skipped once beneath her skin. Kale's eyes met hers, and the answer was already there before he spoke. "They've declared you dead." Seline stilled, not from shock, not even from disbelief, only from the sudden weight of understanding. How? Prophet's decree. Spread through the southern territory first. Your body was returned to the goddess. Your sacrifice completed. "And I didn't even have the courtesy to die for them," she said, her mouth curving at the edge, not in humor, but in something bitter and sharp. Kyle stepped closer, crouching beside the fire, the parchment held loosely in his hand. His other hand settled against his knee, fingers twitching once before they stilled. He was close enough for her to see the shadows beneath his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the way his body braced against something he hadn't said yet. "They're using it," he said, twisting it into proof. "Proof of what?" "That the goddess took you back, that your death sanctified the prophecy, that your escape was a test, and your fall into Shadowclaw was the final offering." Seline let the words sink in slowly, her hands clenched in the folds of the blanket. "They've turned my rebellion into a ritual," she murmured. Kyle nodded once. "They're preparing for war, not just for your return now, for retribution." The fire crackled louder for a moment, then settled. She looked at him, eyes unflinching. "They'll come here." "They already have," Kyle said. "But not like this. This is different. This is spectacle. They want blood under banners." Seline felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, not grief, just the slow, grinding weight of inevitability finally taking shape. "I'm not a martyr," she said. "They don't get to turn me into one." Kyle didn't answer at first. His gaze held hers. No command, no comfort, only the quiet, patient weight of shared ground. "You're not theirs," he said. She reached for the parchment, fingers brushing his as she took it. The contact sent a small jolt up her arm, a warmth that sank into her skin like it belonged there. She didn't read the letter. She didn't need to. Her death had already been written, but she was still breathing. And so long as she breathed, they hadn't won. Kyle stood slowly, the lines of his body sharper in the firelight. He looked at her differently now, not with caution, not even with curiosity, with something deeper, with knowing. She rose, the blanket sliding away, bare feet brushing the cool stone, her body strong in its stillness. She stepped toward him without hesitation, her hand reaching for his, not as a question, but as an answer. Their fingers linked. No words passed between them. But the silence between their bodies was no longer hesitant. It was intent.
Kale's point of view. The declaration of her death had done something he hadn't expected. It had awakened her. He watched the way she stood before him now, spine straight, eyes burning with quiet fire, her body wrapped in nothing but candlelight and conviction. She wasn't mourning the lie they'd written about her. She was preparing to tear it apart. He had seen countless wolves rally beneath rage. Few had stood like this, calm, collected, dangerous because they were not shouting. He held her hand because she had offered it, not because she needed him. She stepped closer, just enough to close the space between them, and for a moment, they stood still, heat brushing from skin to skin, a charge in the air that neither of them resisted. She looked up at him, and there was no fear in her eyes. Only promise. Kyle lifted his free hand slowly, his thumb brushing beneath her jaw. Her breath hitched, not from hesitation, but from awareness. Her skin was warm, alive with the tension that had followed them for weeks. He leaned in just close enough that her lips parted. Not a kiss. Not yet. Just breath and nearness. Just the knowledge that he could, and she would not pull away. Her voice came soft, not as a whisper, but as a vow. "Let them think I'm dead." Kyle's mouth curved, the faintest edge of a smile that never reached his eyes. "They'll regret it." And still he didn't kiss her. Because when he did, when they did, he knew it wouldn't be soft. It would be everything. Chapter 17. His scent on her skin.
Seline's point of view. The storm didn't break with violence. It crept in. The sky bruised slowly through the late afternoon, deepening from gray to something darker, heavier. By the time the first raindrops touched the lodge rooftop, the air was thick with that quiet, electric stillness that came before weather turned wild. Seline had always been taught to fear storms. Not the kind with wind and thunder, but the kind that tore through lives in the form of men, doctrines, and twisted truths. The kind that came in the name of gods. But this was a real storm. She stood by the open window of her room, the wooden shutters wide, the scent of rain and pine curling in. A single candle burned behind her, casting a soft halo against the far wall. Her hair was unbound, slightly damp from her walk earlier, clinging to her shoulders and the back of her neck in slow, curling tendrils. She hadn't spoken since they returned from the council hall. Kale hadn't followed her, not because he was keeping distance, but because he trusted her to come to him when she was ready. And she was. It wasn't desire alone that drew her to him tonight. It was something that had grown day by day in the moments between silence and breath, in the way his gaze never flinched from her truth, and the way he let her burn without trying to extinguish her fire. He was not her savior. He never tried to be. That's why she was drawn to him. The door creaked open behind her. She didn't turn. She had left it unlatched for a reason. His footsteps were quiet, bare feet on wood, padded with the kind of control only wolves carried. The scent of him reached her first. Something wild and grounded, like smoke caught in cedar, underpinned by heat and earth and storm. She felt his presence before he touched her, standing just behind, not yet pressing close. The silence between them was weightless and thick all at once. "You're cold," he said. Her lips parted slightly, breath steady but low. "No." His hand came forward, fingers brushing her arm, not with heat, but something else, anchoring. He trailed up her forearm slowly, to her shoulder, then rested lightly at the base of her neck. His thumb grazed the skin beneath her collarbone. She leaned back, only a breath, but it was enough. "I can still feel your blood on me," she said, quieter now. "From the fight. It never washed away completely." Kale's voice dropped lower, close to her ear. "Good." Seline turned slowly, her body catching his in a lazy arc of motion, until they faced each other in the dusk-lit room. He was shirtless again, his chest broad and lined with faint bruises that hadn't been there the day before. She reached up and touched one of them, just above his ribs. Her fingers grazed his skin with no urgency, no fear. His breath shifted beneath her hand. "You never back away," she murmured. "I don't know how." Her gaze lifted to his. His eyes weren't softened now. They were sharp, focused. He looked at her like he could already feel her under his hands, but he didn't reach. That restraint stirred something deeper in her. She stepped forward until her body aligned with his, her chest brushing his just enough to feel the heat of him. She tipped her face upward, mouth nearly touching his jaw, and then, slowly, deliberately, she inhaled. The scent of him settled inside her like fire curling low in her belly. Her wolf responded to it with a hum of satisfaction, quiet and possessive. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to.
Kale's point of view, she moved like smoke, slow, curling, dangerous if caught too close. Kale didn't touch her as she came nearer. He didn't need to. The space between them was vanishing breath by breath, and each second tightened his control like wire drawn around a flame. Her scent clung to the air, warm skin, crushed herbs from her earlier walk, the faint iron tang that hadn't fully left her from the fight. But beneath that, something new had begun to rise. Her arousal was subtle but deliberate, not masked by shame or hesitation. She let it be known. It unraveled something in him. He lifted one hand, fingers grazing her waist, then her spine, resting lightly there. No pressure. She exhaled against his neck, the sound barely audible, her breath whispering across his skin. His restraint fractured by a thread. Her lips brushed his jaw, not a kiss, not quite. Just a silent test. She didn't move away. Kale turned his face toward hers slowly, catching her mouth with his, but not to claim, not to devour. The kiss was slow, drawn out, their lips parting with the quiet tension of bodies held too long in stillness. Her hand fisted the side of his trousers as she rose onto her toes, deepening the contact. He steadied her, one arm sliding around her back, the other cupping her jaw. It wasn't desperate, it wasn't right, it was the ache of everything they hadn't allowed themselves. Her fingers dragged up his chest, nails light, mapping the trail of his scars like she was learning a new language. His body responded before thought caught up. His jaw tightened. His breath caught, but he didn't pull her closer. She pulled him. He let her guide him backward until the backs of his knees hit the bed frame. She paused, lips still against his, her eyes asking a question in silence. He answered with a whisper against her mouth. "Only if it's yours." Seline pressed forward, not to seduce, not to prove, only to be near. Her skin brushed his, her hands anchoring him there, and Kale knew this wasn't surrender, it was choice. And in that choice there was something far more sacred than any vow ever carved in blood. She buried her face in his neck as she sat in his lap, legs folding around his hips, her breath shuddering as his hands traced the curves of her back. They didn't rush the moment. They didn't fill it with promises. They stayed there, wrapped in each other, heart to heart, breath to breath, skin warmed by skin. He held her like she wasn't a secret but a truth. And when her scent settled over him completely, seeping into his skin and the space around his bed, he knew it was done. They would never be able to untangle from this, not now. Not after this night. Not when she had marked him with her silence, not when her scent lived on his sheets and her wolf had stopped running. Chapter 18. Scented in Him.
Selene's point of view. The lodge was still when she woke, heavy with the quiet that comes just before sunrise. Pale light filtered through the shutters, soft and gray, painting the wooden floorboards with long strokes of silver. Seline lay on her side, a blanket drawn loosely over her hip, her bare skin warmed by the imprint of the body that had held her through the night. The mattress still carried his weight in the space beside her, though he was no longer there. Kyle had risen before her. She'd felt him shift in the dark, his breath trailing across the back of her neck, warm and even. He hadn't spoken, hadn't tried to hold her back. He had only kissed her shoulder once, slow and deliberate, as if to leave something of himself behind. And he had. Her body still carried his scent. It clung to her skin, warm and earthy, threaded into the hollow of her throat, behind her ears, between her thighs. It wasn't overwhelming. It was grounding. She breathed it in now as she sat up slowly, drawing the blanket across her chest, her muscles stretching with the soft soreness of closeness that had not been rushed or taken. There was no shame in her now, no fear of having given too much. What they had shared had not been a collision. It had been a claiming, and it lived in her now. She stood, gathering the tunic draped over the chair and slipping it over her body. It was his, and the fabric hung loose across her frame, brushing her thighs, the collar wide enough to expose one shoulder. She pulled her hair back with slow fingers, pausing to breathe in again, to feel the way her wolf curled contentedly inside her. Leora was quiet this morning, watching, listening, satisfied. Seline moved through the halls without sound, passing familiar corners, the scents of damp wood and burnt cedar clinging to the edges of the air. The wolves she passed nodded to her, their eyes dipping not with deference, but with something steadier, acknowledgement. There was no more suspicion now, no more whispers. They smelled him on her. They knew, and she didn't flinch beneath their eyes. She found Kale outside, near the training ring, dressed in dark trousers and a loose shirt, his hands wrapped in linen, the sweat on his collarbone already beginning to dry from the early morning rounds. He was speaking with Varek, his second, who paused when Seline stepped into view. His gaze flicked once to Kale, and a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth before he stepped away. wordless. Seline said nothing at first. She stepped to the edge of the ring, letting her fingers drift over the rough wooden rail. Kyle didn't approach, but his eyes didn't leave her. "You left early," she said. His mouth curved slightly, but his voice stayed low. "Didn't want to wake you." "You didn't." The breeze moved between them, cool against her legs, stirring the hem of his tunic she still wore. His gaze dipped briefly, then returned to her face. Seline tilted her head. "They know." "They've always known," he replied. "Now they just see it." Her fingers tightened subtly on the railing. "And what do they see?" Kyle stepped closer then, slow but unflinching, his eyes steady. He didn't touch her, not yet. He didn't need to. "They see the woman who stood in blood and didn't break. The one I would kill for. The one I already bled beside." His voice wasn't soft. It was certain. Celine's pulse stirred, not in fear, but with the quiet rush of something blooming beneath her ribs. She reached for his hand, took it, placed it against her waist beneath the tunic. His fingers flexed slightly, then settled, the heat of his skin sinking into her through the thin cloth. "I don't want to be hidden," she said. "Not here, not with you." "You're not." His hand curved tighter around her waist, drawing her closer until their bodies aligned again. There was nothing rushed in his movement, just intent. "You smell like me," he murmured against her temple. "I want to," she breathed. Kyle didn't kiss her, but the way he held her, broad palm pressed to the small of her back, breath slipping down her throat, was more intimate than any kiss. He was branding her in his own quiet way, not to own, to mark, to claim without chains.
Kale's point of view. She wore his shirt like it belonged to her, and it did. Kale watched the way she moved through the clearing, the hem brushing her bare thighs, her hair pulled back loosely at her nape. She didn't lower her eyes. She didn't shrink beneath the glances that followed her. She had never looked more like a wolf than she did now, calm, assured, wrapped in the scent of the male who would burn everything down before letting her be taken again. The night still clung to him, her breath against his skin. The sound she'd made when her body arched into his, the way she had whispered his name like it wasn't just a word, but a promise. He hadn't touched another woman since before his first kill, and even then, nothing had stayed with him like this. She wasn't a distraction. She was the reason his walls had finally cracked, and her hand tightened in his. She leaned into him with a quiet, subtle strength, and the wolves who watched did not question. They turned away, not out of discomfort, out of respect. Kale rested his hand low on her back and walked with her into the lodge, saying nothing more. They passed the halls in silence, side by side, her hair brushing his shoulder, the sound of their footfalls twin echoes on the wooden floor. In his room, she didn't pause. She stepped out of the shirt, folded it once, then climbed into his bed like she'd done it 100 times. Her wolf curled into the blankets. Her body softened into the space he had made for her. Kale followed her without a word. The scent of her lingered on his skin, soaked into the sheets carved into his throat. And for the first time in his life, the storm outside didn't feel like a threat. It felt like protection. Chapter 19. The way he watches her.
Celine's point of view. The midday sun filtered through the treetops in shards of gold, softening the shadows cast by the lodge's stone walls. Seline moved through the herb garden behind the main building, her hands streaked with soil. The sleeves of her tunic rolled past her elbows. The scent of rosemary and wild mint clung to her skin, mingling with the warmth of pine and wood smoke that had settled over the stronghold after the morning rain. She worked in silence, gathering roots and trimming leaves, the repetition grounding her. Each movement was purposeful, steadying. It had been too long since her hands had done something that didn't involve surviving. Here, in the quiet of the garden, she wasn't anyone's chosen vessel or claimed possession. She was simply a woman among green things, but she felt him watching. She didn't need to look up to know Kale stood at the edge of the field, arms crossed, gaze locked on her. His presence had become a weight she welcomed, never pressing, never demanding, only there, like gravity, like breath. Since that night, everything had changed, and yet not at all. They hadn't spoken of it. They hadn't needed to. The way she moved through the lodge now, wrapped in the scent of him, the way her wolf quieted when he entered a room. Those were the conversations they didn't put into words. He hadn't tried to name what they were. And still, he watched her like she belonged to him. Her fingers closed around a stalk of sage. She clipped it clean, brushed her hand across her brow, and finally turned. He stood near the fence line, shirt damp from training, a light sheen of sweat along his collarbone. His eyes didn't soften when they met hers. If anything, they sharpened, heat simmering low behind them. It wasn't lust alone. That would have been simpler. It was the slow burn of knowing, of seeing her as she was and wanting her still. Seline wiped her hands on the edge of her tunic and crossed the garden toward him. She didn't hurry. She never did now. When she reached him, she didn't speak. Just stood within the circle of his heat, her breath calm, her eyes steady. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then to her throat, where a faint mark still lingered from his teeth, not deep enough to bind, but there, a choice left unspoken. "I can feel when you look at me," she said finally. Kale didn't flinch. "Then you know I don't plan to stop." She tilted her chin up, a challenge without aggression. "Why?" "Because you move like you've spent your life being watched by those who wanted to break you, and I want to be the one who watches you heal." Her breath caught, not from surprise, but because something in those words landed too deep, too true. Kale reached for her hand, dirt and all, and brought it to his chest. He didn't kiss her fingers. He didn't clean them. He placed them over the place where his heart beat slow and constant. "You don't have to be soft for me," he said. Her throat tightened. "I don't want to be soft. I want to be real." "Then be..." And with that, the space between them ceased to matter.
Kale's point of view. He had watched her in 100 small ways, from a distance, in passing, in silence. But never like this. Never as a man who had felt the shape of her body in the dark, who had traced her skin with his mouth, who had held her breath in his hands and let it go without claiming it. She didn't belong to him, but the way she looked at him now, the steadiness in her stance, the fire that never left her eyes, he knew she had let him in farther than she had ever let another. He had expected her to shrink, to fold inward after that night, the way some did when faced with intimacy that didn't hurt. But Seline didn't shrink. She burned brighter. He wanted her not because she was broken, but because she had pieced herself together without flinching. And now, standing in the garden, with her fingers still smudged in soil, and her mouth parted just enough to draw in his scent, she was the most dangerous thing he'd ever seen. Because he wanted her in ways that had nothing to do with prophecy, nothing to do with war. He wanted her in silence, in dark corners, in the places where no one demanded anything from either of them. When she leaned into him, her hands pressing against his chest, Kale curved one arm around her waist, guiding her gently toward the shadowed alcove near the herb wall. He didn't kiss her mouth. He kissed the underside of her jaw, slow, savoring. Her breath hitched again, just slightly, her hands tightening on his shirt. "Kale," she whispered, and he felt his name burn through him. He pinned her lightly against the wall, not with force, but with need. Her fingers slipped beneath his shirt, palms warm, exploring the ridges of muscle along his ribs. He didn't stop her. He didn't want her to stop, but he kept his control. Barely. He kissed her once, slow and deep, then pulled back far enough to look at her fully. Her lips were flushed, her eyes dark. "You undo me," he said. And she answered, voice steady, "Then come undone." He didn't. Not yet. Because when he did, he knew it wouldn't be just his control that unraveled. It would be his loyalty to everything else. And she was the only thing he'd want left standing. Chapter 20. He can't let her go.
Selene's point of view. The woods breathed quietly around her, all hushed pine and damp earth, the late dusk painting everything in bruised colors, indigo, rust, the fading gold of day surrendering to night. Seline moved between the trees without sound, her steps practiced, deliberate. The wind tugged at her braid as she walked, the scent of moss and coming rain clinging to the fabric of her cloak. She wasn't running. She was deciding. The letter still burned in her pocket. Folded once, sealed with the ash mark of the old rite, it had arrived that morning, tucked into a pouch left by the stream. The seal had been broken before she touched it. Kyle had read it first. He hadn't hidden that from her. But he hadn't told her everything in it either. Not in words. She had seen it in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way he stood too still after delivering it. A quiet warning. The Moonlight Covenant had sent a message not of threats, but of invitation. A ritual gathering, not yet a raid. A last, false olive branch dressed in scripture and sacred tradition. She had not read the full words, but she knew the scent of their games. They wanted her to return willingly, to walk back into chains wearing a crown. Kale hadn't stopped her when she left the lodge at dusk, but he was following her. She could feel him, not his footsteps, not his breath, just him. The way her wolf stirred beneath her skin, alert but not alarmed. He was letting her go just far enough to prove she wasn't running. She wondered if he would follow her all the way back to the border if she kept walking. But she wouldn't. She reached the edge of the ridge above the river, the one that curled along the edge of Shadowclaw territory, marking the boundary line etched in blood long before either of them was born. The wind caught her hair there, lifting loose strands across her cheek. She didn't brush them away. She stood still, eyes scanning the darkening horizon. Behind her, the sound of leaves shifting. She didn't turn. "I thought you might come."
Kyle's point of view. She stood with her back to him, all sharp lines and stillness, her cloak drawn tight, her posture unreadable. The last light of day caught her in pieces, highlighting the curve of her cheek, the edge of her jaw, the soft gleam of silver where her braid wrapped once over her shoulder. She looked like something carved out of the dusk itself. A blade, hidden in softness. He stayed a few paces back. "I told myself I wouldn't follow you," he said. "And I still ended up here." Seline didn't turn, but her voice reached him clearly. "Because you don't trust me?" "Because I don't trust them." She exhaled long and slow and finally turned to face him. Her eyes found his, and he saw the storm in them before she spoke. Not fear, not regret, conflict. "They want me to choose," she said. And they're baiting me with something I don't even believe in anymore. But part of me still hears their voices, still feels the weight of the collar, even without it. Kale stepped closer. They trained you to doubt your own freedom. And still, she said softly, I didn't stop walking. His throat tightened. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the woman who had once knelt beneath prophecy now standing in defiance of it. The woman who had laid her body in his bed without fear, who had let his scent claim her, not because she was his, but because she wanted to be. And yet the pull of her past still lived inside her, coiled in old scars and sacred lies. He reached for her, not roughly, not to hold her down or back, just to touch. His hand found her face, cupping her cheek, thumb brushing the line beneath her eye. Her skin was warm. Her breath faltered. And when she leaned into his palm, he knew it, not as victory, but as surrender. I can't let you go, he said. Selene's eyes flicked up to his. Then don't. It wasn't permission. It wasn't request. It was truth. He pulled her in then, wrapped her against him with both arms, burying his face in the curve of her neck. She smelled like pine and rain, and the faintest trace of the herbs from the garden. She smelled like the earth that had made her. And she smelled like him. She clung to his shirt with both hands, her fingers tightening in the fabric, not from fear, but from something quieter, something more dangerous. Belonging. She pressed her mouth to his throat, slow and deliberate. A single kiss where his pulse beat strongest. He felt it echo everywhere. He held her tighter, trying to say something without words. You're not going back. You don't have to fight this alone. You're mine, but not owned. Chosen. They stood like that as the sky deepened and the stars began to push through the haze above the treetops. Neither of them moved. There was no need. He had followed her into the dusk, and now she was following him back. Chapter 21. The way he holds her.
Selene's point of view. The wind carried the scent of ashwood and snowmelt through the valley as the mountains exhaled the season's first frost. The chill settled into the lodge's bones, curling through the narrow corridors, brushing across the backs of Selene's hands as she stood in the bathing room, steam rising from the copper basin. Water trickled slowly from the pitcher she tilted, the rhythm steady, careful, as she poured over her arms and let the warmth soak into her skin. Her body still remembered the night before, the weight of Kale's hand between her shoulder blades, the quiet hush of his breath pressed against her spine, the way he had not spoken when she trembled, but held her like she was made of something sacred and breakable all at once. There had been no rush between them, just the slow unraveling of a knot neither of them had dared to name. She closed her eyes as water slid down her neck. The air was cold, but her chest stayed warm. That warmth wasn't from the fire crackling in the hearth behind her. It was from him. Kale hadn't left her side since they'd returned from the ridge. Not in the obvious ways, not with touches or words that tried to own, but in the small things, the way his eyes tracked her across the room, the way his wolf quieted when hers stirred. She didn't have to ask if he was near anymore. She simply felt it. She dried her arms with a thick cloth, wrapping it around her shoulders before stepping barefoot across the wooden floor. The faint echo of voices downstairs reached her. War council talk, likely. Strategies whispered in smoke and steel. But Kyle wasn't among them. He was waiting. She found him in his room, seated near the far window, the soft blue-gray of twilight brushing across his features. He looked up when she entered, but didn't move. He only watched her with that same unreadable calm that had unsettled her once, but now felt like home. She didn't speak. She walked to him, slow and barefoot, and sat in his lap, like she had done it 1,000 times before. His arms folded around her immediately.
Kael's point of view. There was a difference in how she let him touch her now. No tension, no pause, no measuring the weight of his hands before deciding whether or not to lean in. She moved with certainty, not because he demanded it, but because she did. And when she slid into his lap, her legs folding across his thighs, her cheek resting against his chest, it wasn't for comfort alone. It was to be known. She didn't hide her scent, even freshly bathed. If anything, it was stronger now, earthy, sweet, threaded with his own. His wolf stirred at the contact, satisfied but restless, the instinct to protect tangled in something less primal, more human. Affection. That word didn't belong to Kale easily. But it lived here, in the way he curled his arm around her waist and buried his nose in her hair. Her skin was warm against his. She didn't speak. Her breath moved in a slow rhythm that calmed his own, even as the world around them shifted closer to war. For now, he didn't care. He had her. Here. Soft and real and still. He brushed his hand along her thigh, thumb trailing beneath the hem of the robe she wore. Not with demand. Just presence. Just quiet proof that he knew she was real and in his arms. She moved slightly, just enough to feel his breath hitch. She felt everything. That was the danger of her. She didn't just look. She saw. And now she saw him. He rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in. "You're not sleeping much." "I don't want to," she murmured. "Why?" "Because when I close my eyes, I remember too much. But when I stay awake, I feel this. You. And it's the first thing that's ever felt like mine." Kyle didn't answer right away. He didn't know how to say what it meant to hear that, how rare it was for someone to speak to him without fear, without trying to manipulate or control. She asked nothing of him except that he be. Not alpha, not protector, just Kale. He shifted her gently, lifting her until she straddled him, her knees bracketing his hips, her hands slipping beneath his shirt. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask permission. She pressed her forehead to his, and they stayed there, joined not by need, but by recognition. The tension between them never faded. It changed, sharpened, thickened. Her fingers traced his chest, memorizing the lines of old scars and new muscle, the steady rise and fall of breath beneath skin. He let her. He watched her eyes move as if seeing him differently now, not as alpha, not as the wolf who had taken her in, but as the man who had chosen her, and kept choosing her, even when he hadn't spoken it aloud. "You hold me like I matter," she whispered. "You do." She leaned in then, not to kiss, but to rest her cheek against his again, their breaths mingling. The moment didn't need more. Not yet. Her heart beat against his. Slow. Steady. And for the first time, Kale didn't feel the urge to protect her from everything outside that room. He just wanted to hold her there in the quiet where she finally believed she was safe. Chapter 22. He makes her stay.
Selene's point of view. Nightfall came with a hush, the kind of silence that held its breath, not from peace, but from anticipation. The fire in Kale's room had burned low, casting the space in amber and shadow. Outside the stone walls, the pack was stirring, tension rising beneath the calm. Too many scouts returning with stories that didn't add up. Too many signs pointing toward the inevitable. The Covenant wasn't retreating. They were preparing. Seline sat on the edge of Kael's bed, hands folded in her lap, staring at the worn floorboards. She hadn't spoken in some time, her thoughts turning over too many pieces at once. The letter, the border, the whispered prophecy naming Kale as the false wolf, and her as the bride stolen from divinity. None of it meant what it once had, and yet the past never left quietly. It waited at the edge of every decision she made, pressing at the backs of her eyes, trying to crawl beneath her skin again. She could feel it starting. That old pull toward flight. The instinct to leave before she was taken. Before the pain returned. Before it was him who burned for knowing her. She stood. Her boots were already by the door. Her cloak waited draped across the chair. But she didn't make it 2 steps before his voice cut through the quiet. Don't.
Kale's point of view. He hadn't looked up when she rose. He'd heard the soft rustle of cloth, the shift in her breathing, the way her heartbeat began to stutter. Not with panic, but with the kind of resolve born from too many goodbyes. He'd kept his eyes on the flames, listening to the silence warp around her. When he finally spoke, the word came low. Controlled. Seline stilled at the sound. He rose slowly from the chair, not rushing, not commanding, just closing the space between them with deliberate steps. When he stopped, he stood behind her, close enough for his body heat to press into her back, close enough for her scent to flood his senses. He didn't reach for her yet. "I know what it looks like," she said quietly. "Me leaving. Again. But this time it's not running." "Yes, it is," he said. "It just has a different face." She turned, her eyes lit by the fire behind him. "If I stay, they'll come. They'll come for me. For you. For this pack. You saw the seal on the letter. You know what that means." Kale's jaw shifted. "I also know they expect you to do exactly this. Walk away before anyone can stand with you." Her breath caught, and he saw the flicker in her eyes. That was where they had broken her, deep beneath the skin, in the place where trust tried to grow. That wound hadn't healed. Not yet. He raised a hand and brushed his fingers along her jaw. She didn't pull away. Her body leaned in, almost involuntarily, like she was fighting herself even as she craved the contact. "You're not a danger to us," he said. "You're the reason half of them still believe we can win." She laughed once, hollow. "I was a myth to them, a story. Something broken and saved." "No," he murmured. "You were fire, and they watched you survive it." She shook her head. "I can't be the reason." "You already are." He stepped in, pressing his palm to the small of her back, guiding her gently but firmly until she backed into the wall beside the door. Her eyes locked on his, wide but unafraid. His hand slid up her side over the curve of her ribs, stopping just beneath her heart. He felt it beat. "You leave now," he said. "And you give them the last part of you they haven't already stolen." She exhaled, her forehead resting against his chest. Her hands curled into his shirt. "I don't know how to stop feeling like I belong to them," she whispered. Kyle bent his head, his breath brushing her temple. "Then let me remind you."
Seline's point of view. She didn't stop him when his hands moved higher. She didn't resist when his mouth found the side of her throat, kissing her like a promise he had no intention of breaking. Her fingers slid beneath his shirt, feeling the heat of him, the rawness just beneath his restraint. He made no sound, but she felt the tension running through him like coiled wire. Not lust, something deeper, something almost afraid. He was scared to lose her. That broke something inside her more than threats or prophecy ever could. She kissed him then, hard and unyielding, her hands in his hair, pulling him down until her mouth caught his, and the breath between them twisted into something sharp. He pushed her back against the wall with a low exhale, not rough, but certain, his hands bracketing her hips, holding her there like a lifeline. His scent was everywhere now, smoke and pine and heat, and she welcomed it. Let it soak into her skin. Let it replace the old scent of incense and blood and sanctified lies. When his lips dragged down her throat, when his teeth grazed her collarbone, she felt her wolf stir, not in warning, but in hunger. For him. For this. For the safety of not being alone in her fire anymore. She didn't try to speak again, because when he kissed her, when he held her so tightly the past couldn't find its way between them, he didn't ask her to stay. He made her want to.
Chapter 23. He lets her break.
Selene's point of view. The dreams had returned, not the surreal kind made of symbols and smoke. These were vivid, sharp, and full of voices she thought she had silenced. She heard the prophet's breath as he whispered the litany of her fate into her hair, heard the rustle of silk robes and the sound of bare feet on sacred stone. The scent of incense clung to her, even after waking, sweet, suffocating, cloying, and the collar she no longer wore still felt like iron wrapped around her neck. Seline sat upright in Kale's bed, the sheets tangled around her legs, the room dim with early morning gray. Her skin was damp with sweat. The fire in the hearth had long since gone to embers. Beside her, Kale slept on his side, one arm slung loosely where she had once been. She watched the slow rise and fall of his breath, his brow smooth, mouth relaxed. So unlike the man the world feared. But she couldn't lie beside him. Not now. Not while her body still shook. Not while her memories threatened to pull her under again. She slipped from the bed with care, padded across the floor, and pulled one of his flannels around her shoulders. The fabric was soft, worn from use, still warm with his scent. But it didn't soothe her this time. The weight in her chest didn't lift. Her breathing stayed shallow. She stepped outside, letting the cold slap her cheeks, sharp enough to wake her nerves. The trees loomed dark and silent, and the fog hadn't yet burned off the valley. The pack was still asleep. Only the crows stirred in the distance, crying low from the ridge like sentinels. Her hands trembled at her sides. She clenched them into fists. She wanted to scream, but she didn't. She wanted to run, but she didn't, because she wasn't that girl anymore. But then why did she still feel like she might split in two? The sound of the door opening behind her made her flinch. Heavy, slow, not startled, but caught. And she hated that she felt that way, even here, even now. She didn't turn until his hands were on her.
Kale's point of view. She wasn't shivering from cold. Kale knew the difference, the way her shoulders tensed beneath his touch, the way her body held itself too still, like every muscle was braced for something unseen. She didn't lean into him, she didn't pull away. She just stood there, tall, silent, and breaking from the inside out. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, palms flat over her stomach, holding her steady, letting his warmth bleed into the cold places. Her breath stuttered once, then again. And still she didn't speak. So he didn't ask, and he just stayed. She leaned back finally, just enough for the weight of her to settle against his chest. Her head tilted, resting just under his jaw, and her hands slid over his, locking them in place like she was afraid he might let go. "I used to think pain was holy," she said softly. He said nothing. "They told me that suffering was proof of devotion, that the more I bled, the more the gods would see me, that if I broke open enough, they'd pour something divine into what was left." Her voice was steady, but her breath trembled through every word. "I let them do things, I believed things, and now I don't even know where my choices began." Kale buried his face in her hair. His jaw clenched. His grip didn't tighten. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. He just listened. "I don't feel clean," she whispered. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You're not dirty." "But I feel it. Inside. In places I can't reach." He turned her gently, guiding her to face him, his hand staying on her arms. Her eyes were glassy in the dim light, not crying, but holding back something far worse. "I keep waiting for you to see it," she said. "The part of me they used. The part I can't hide." Kyle didn't answer. He just stepped forward and pulled her into him, fully, fiercely. His hand cradled the back of her head, his other arm wrapping tight around her back as she buried her face in his chest and finally broke. She didn't sob. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. But her body collapsed against him in waves, breath hitching, shoulders trembling, like something inside her had been unlocked, and now it was spilling out whether she wanted it to or not. And then he held her. He let her break, without fixing it, without rushing her, without making it about him. They stayed like that as the morning rose around them. The fog lifted. The light grew stronger. The warmth of his body steadied hers. When she finally looked up, her eyes rimmed red, cheeks damp, his hand found her jaw, thumb brushing the wetness away. He didn't kiss her. He just looked at her like she hadn't been broken at all, like she was whole, like she was still his. Chapter 24. She lets him in.
Celine's point of view. The sun fell in ribbons across the stone floor as Seline moved through the quiet lodge, her bare feet soft against the cool surface, Kale's scent still clinging to her skin from where he had held her that morning. The weight of the night before had not lifted, not entirely, but it had shifted. Something inside her had finally broken open, but not into pieces, into space, into air. As if grief, once spoken aloud, had made room for something else. She found herself in the training hall, though she hadn't meant to go there. The space was empty, the scent of old wood and worn leather thick in the still air. Shadows clung to the corners, but they no longer felt like watchers. Just remnants of silence. She walked slowly, trailing her fingers along the padded wall, the echo of footfalls from earlier sparring matches barely lingering in the dust. Her body still remembered movement. Attack, dodge, defend. But today, she wasn't here to fight. She sat in the center of the floor, legs folded beneath her, back straight, her hands resting palm down on her knees. For the first time in weeks, she simply breathed. No chasing her next move, no pressing fear behind her ribs, just breath and presence. The wolf within her stirred, not with urgency, but awareness. Kale was coming. She felt him before she heard him. His energy always arrived before his body did, something low and anchoring, the steady hum that filled the space before his foot crossed the threshold. He didn't speak when he entered. He never did when he found her like this. She heard his steps pause, then continue, measured, slow. She didn't open her eyes until she felt his warmth near her.
Kale's point of view. She was sitting in the middle of the floor, her spine like a bowstring, her hair falling in loose waves down her back. The light brushed her shoulders, pale gold against bare skin where her tunic had slipped slightly to one side. She didn't flinch when he approached, didn't stiffen. That meant more than any words she could have spoken. He lowered himself behind her, not touching but near enough for his breath to lift a few strands of her hair. He waited, not because she asked for it, but because she deserved that choice. After a long, quiet stretch, she leaned back. Not far, just enough to let her shoulders brush his knees. That was her answer. Kale reached forward, slow and careful, and placed his hands on her waist, thumbs brushing over her ribs through the fabric. She didn't move. Her head tilted slightly to the side, her breath deepening, not with arousal, but with trust. The kind that came only after a fall. She whispered something then. He barely caught it. I don't know how to love someone outside of obedience. Kale closed his eyes for a moment. Let the words settle before speaking. Then we'll unlearn it together. Seline turned her head to look at him, her profile outlined in soft light. He saw it all in her face. The fear, the hope, the wanting she didn't know how to name. She wasn't asking him to fix her. She was asking him to stay while she figured out who she was without the chains. He moved his hand slowly, fingers trailing up her spine, not in seduction, but reverence. Every scar, every healed bruise, every place someone else had tried to take from her. He touched it like it mattered, like it was part of the story, but not the ending. She shifted then, turning in his lap, straddling him with slow precision. Her knees bracketed his hips, her hands finding his shoulders as she settled fully against him. Her body was warm, her pulse steady, but rising. She was letting him feel her without armor. He held her hips, grounding them both. You don't have to give me anything, he murmured. I want to, she said, barely louder than a breath. Seline leaned in, forehead to forehead, her hands sliding from his shoulders to the sides of his neck. Their mouths hovered, breath mingling, not yet touching. The tension between them wasn't the sharp pull of desperation. It was the steady ache of wanting to be known truly and completely. When she kissed him, it was slow, a question, not a demand. He answered her with stillness, then depth, then the quiet shudder of restraint unraveling at the edges. Her fingers curled into his hair, his hands flexed on her waist. The world narrowed to breath and heartbeat and heat shared between two people who had bled too much to ever take something precious lightly. He didn't rush, and she didn't ask him to. When they finally broke apart, their foreheads still touching, she exhaled a truth that had never passed her lips before. I don't want to be worshipped. He smiled faintly, eyes still closed. Good. I only want to be yours. And this time, when she leaned back in, she didn't hesitate. She let him all the way in. Chapter 25. She chooses him.
Seline's point of view. The sky was heavy with stormlight, that pale silver just before rain, where the air holds too much stillness, and everything feels like it's waiting to change. Seline stood at the edge of the cliff, where the old stones overlooked the northern border, the place where the land of the covenant ended and the free wild began. The same place where she had first collapsed in the mud, bruised and breathless, thinking she'd run far enough to disappear. She hadn't disappeared. She had become. Below her, the valley stretched, cloaked in mist and pine. Behind her, the Shadowclaw Lodge stood steady, half hidden in the trees, its windows glowing with quiet life. There were voices inside, laughter even, the crackle of fire, the sharpening of blades. They were preparing. Not for her to run again, but for what came next. She was not their guest now. She was part of them. And still, standing here, she felt the pull. The wind whispered in the old voice, the one she'd been born under, the one that had named her a bride before she had known the weight of her own body. That voice still called from across the ridge, promising sanctity, legacy, belonging. The covenant would never stop speaking her name. But for the first time, she didn't feel hollow in the silence that followed. She didn't flinch when she heard footsteps approach behind her. She knew the rhythm of his gait now better than her own breath. Kale didn't speak right away. He stepped beside her, arms folded, gaze fixed on the horizon. His presence alone shifted the ground beneath her feet. Not with force, but with gravity. He didn't reach for her. He didn't have to. I was going to leave again, she said quietly. I know, he replied. But I didn't. No! She turned to him then fully. The wind tossed strands of her hair across her face, and he reached out without thinking, tucking them behind her ear, his fingers brushing her cheek like he didn't want to stop touching her. His hand lingered there, warm, real, grounding. "I was waiting for someone to come save me," she said. "Then I thought maybe I could save myself, but it was never about that." His brows lifted slightly. "What was it about?" "Choosing." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from truth. Not running, not surviving, just choosing.
Kyle's point of view. She looked at him like she saw the man, not the alpha, not the wolf, not the one the prophecy warned about, or the leader who stood in the way of a holy war, just him. And she was right. It had always been about choice. She had been born inside a story someone else wrote. Now she was writing her own. He took her hand not as a promise, not as a claim, but as an offering. Her fingers curled around his, slowly, then tightly, as if anchoring herself to the moment. To him, his chest rose with a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. "I'm not going to ask you to stay," he said. "Not because I don't want you to, but because I need to know it's your voice that answers." Seline didn't hesitate. "I'm staying." The wind shifted. The sky didn't break open. The world didn't fall silent. But something in him did. The part that had been waiting. She stepped into his arms, and he folded her in with a care that never wavered. He didn't kiss her. He held her, forehead resting against hers, the way he always did when he didn't have enough words. Her breath moved against his neck. Her fingers dug into his shirt, not as a reflex, but as an anchor. They stood like that for a long time, the storm never quite breaking, the thunder never quite arriving. The tension that had lived between them since the night she crashed into his border finally settled, not because the world was fixed, but because they were. She had run through fire and ash to find him. He had stood in the path of prophecy to hold her, and together they had torn down the walls of what had been written. Seline tilted her head, her mouth brushing his jaw, her voice barely a whisper. "You are the only thing they couldn't predict?" Kale smiled just slightly. "You were the only thing I couldn't control." And when their lips met, it was not frantic, not desperate, it was deep, certain. The kind of kiss that anchored bones and rewrote bloodlines. She had chosen him, and he would never let her forget it.